Hey there, and welcome to the Vassals of Kingsgrave. In this episode, we'll be discussing A Hymn to Spring, which is a collection of essays analysing George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. My name is Duncan, or Valkyrist on the forums, and I am joined today by...
Hi, this is Sarah, Dr. Blood on the forums.
This is Wilson, Wandering Prophet on the forums.
Well, thanks for coming on, guys. So before we begin, is there any news that people wanted to mention? A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones news?
I think the next installment in George's history of the world of Ice and Fire is coming out in November or December, the Fire and Blood.
Right.
That's coming out this year, yeah.
Fire and Blood. And this is, I think you were saying that this is pieces that he left out. He wasn't able to fit in the world of Ice and Fire?
Yes, I think this was, I don't know if the other authors are in it as well, but this is mainly focused on the Targaryen dynasty before the Dance of Dragons.
Yeah.
So I think this is what didn't make it into the world of Ice and Fire. This is what we get now in its original form.
And it looks like a pretty extensive collection of writing. Like, it's not like these little novellas. It seems like a pretty big compendium akin to World of Ice and Fire. I think originally at one point it was sort of dubbed the G.R.R. Marillion or something.
I can't pronounce it now.
I know, it's not it looks good in type, but you can't actually pronounce it.
Yes. I don't know if it will be as large as the World of Ice and Fire coffee table edition. That's quite big, but this promises to be very informative and to fill in holes.
Are you guys looking forward to it? Or I know a lot of people in the fandom are kind of annoyed that it's not Wins, but are you guys looking forward to reading it?
I'm really excited about it. I'm a huge dork for all the backstory and the history and stuff like that. Yeah. So I'm definitely really excited about it.
Same here. I have some questions that I hope these writings will answer about Targaryens. So
yeah, I'm not hugely excited. Like, I probably will read it, even though, but I just, like, the Targaryens have always been, like, the least interesting to me. I mean, they are fascinating just because they're, like, such a train wreck of a dynasty. It's just like, well, I think we're too powerful at this point and there's too much order. Let's go to war and then start blowing things up. It's like, oh my God, guys, you had it and you lost it.
You had it, exactly. You had it. You just had to maintain, but couldn't do that. No, it's okay. Not as exciting as book 7, but better than nothing, I think.
Well, I feel like because earlier in the year he sort of announced that there wouldn't be Winds of Winter in 2018, and I felt like there was this collective kind of sigh of annoyance, and the fandom. I don't know. Just to me, I got a sense that the fandom kind of went dormant for kind of the first half of the year.
Yeah. I think that's fair. Yeah, I think there's so much anticipation, but also, I mean, you can't maintain that level for an indefinite period. You know what I mean? You kind of have to go cyclically, I think.
Because, I mean, it's been 7-8 years that we've been talking about these 5 books, but it almost feels like we've talked about every possible morsel of detail, come up with every crazy theory we could, and it's like, come on, George, we just need another installment that'll sustain us for another 7 years.
Even a preview chapter or something like the prologue or something like that, but just some kind of further development would be nice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I have faith. As long as we get Winds of Winter, like I'm sort of coming to the conclusion that we might not get to the end of the series, but as long as we get Winds,
Agreed indeed.
Especially if it is actually, what did you say, big enough to kill a rat at some point, like.
I know his books have weight. They have real power behind them. They could be used as weapons in one of his stories.
Could. They certainly could. So,
you can imagine the Mountain killing someone with a hard copy of Winds.
Chapter,
Samwell with a book on a chain, just swinging it around
like a mace. Yeah. Taking White Walkers' heads off.
Exactly.
Is there any? There's not really any Game of Thrones news, is there? Because there's no season this year, and then the final season will be next year. But I haven't heard anything about the contents of the season. Like, I haven't seen any set photos or anything like that.
I try to avoid stuff like that, so I haven't either. But I don't think it has been
seen much. Same here. I don't need spoilers at this point, but there hasn't been much in the way of talk. I heard there was a script leak at one point, but maybe that was false. I didn't investigate to find out if it was true or not.
God, already? That's depressing.
I know. What? But I think, do you know when it's coming out? Is it March? No, April next year?
Oh, is it April? Maybe. I'm just looking at Watchers of the Wall. It says may not air until summer 2019.
Okay.
And then there's an article about a Jon Snow beer. HBO is releasing a Tinder-style Game of Thrones game. So this is what they talk about when there's nothing to talk about.
When there's nothing to talk about.
Oh, no, Emmy nominations, yeah. Are you guys interested in the prequel series that are possibly coming out? The only one I know about is the... isn't there going to be one about the Long Night?
I think so, yeah. Or sort of the Age of Heroes into the Long Night. And then I want to say the other one is about Valeria, but I don't know if that was speculation or whether that's actually been confirmed.
I heard the Valeria one as well before the Doom. I think that's a possibility, but I don't recall. All these things seem like distractions, you know?
Well, that's exactly what they are, Wilson.
It's precisely what they are. So it's like we're waiting for the real news. If George decides to, Mr. Martin, I'm sorry. If Mr. Martin decides to...
that's a Mr. Martin.
You know, yeah, it is Mr. Martin. We have to be nice. I think the impatience of the general fandom has driven him into hiding. And I sense a bit of resentment on his part because it's no longer his story now, it's everyone else's. And so if we are quiet or hush-hush and super respectful for the next, I don't know, couple of years, maybe it will help to spur his creativity some more. I don't know. But
it is, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It is a bit of a George Lucas situation where the fandom now, has almost tried to take ownership of the series away from him, and he's sort of turning against the creator, even though he's the one that's created all this joy for us.
Exactly.
So maybe in 10 years Disney will seize the rights from him and start pumping out a Song of Ice and Fire cinematic universe.
I can't even imagine what that world would look like in Disneyland.
I can. It'll look like every movie that's in the Marvel and Star Wars universe. No, I actually like the Star Wars movies, but anyway. All right. I think that's all the news that I can think of. So let's get into our main discussion, which is A Hymn to Spring. So this is a collection of essays published by Tower of the Hand in 2015, and it features notable contributors from all over the fandom. If you'd like to follow along with us, you can purchase the ebook on Amazon for about $8. And basically each host has picked an essay to recap, followed by a discussion. And you may remember we did an episode on this book last year, so this will be a continuation of that, looking at a new batch of essays. And I will kick us off. So the first essay was written by our very own Amin Javadi of A Podcast of Ice and Fire, and it's called Songs and Singers of Ice and Fire. And this essay looks at the role of music in the Seven Kingdoms as both a form of entertainment and a mechanism for preserving the history and customs of different peoples. Musicians occupy a privileged position in Westerosi society, with talented peasants often finding favour with nobles and being elevated to court life. Like fools, the popularity of singers allows them to tell truths and mock the powerful in ways that the feudal hierarchy would otherwise strictly forbid. In contrast, songs can also serve the powerful in the form of propaganda, such as Lord Tywin's Rains of Castamere, or even through magical instruments, such as Euron Greyjoy's dragon horn. Amin notes that key points of the story are communicated through songs, and several important characters are singers. For example, the wildling Mance Rayder uses music to gather support and convince people to crown him king and to attack the wall. The legendary Rhaegar Targaryen was able to bring nobles to tears with his music, and Barristan Selmy recalls that the crown prince was much happier plucking a harp than swinging a sword. And finally, the series is even called A Song of Ice and Fire, indicating that music is central to understanding its themes and structure. So I really love the songs in the series. I think they add a lot to the world and are just, entertaining in their own right. And I think it's something that Martin took from Tolkien. If any of you guys have read Lord of the Rings, Tolkien also uses songs to build and color his world. But I was wondering, do you guys have a favorite song in A Song of Ice and Fire, or a favorite scene of music?
Well, I think I've memorized the lyrics to The Bear and the Maiden Fair.
For sure, yeah.
It sneaks up on you. Yeah. I don't know if I should make my debut on this podcast, but it's in the works. It's one of those, it does add life in Ice and Fire. That definitely is true, I think. But to your question, the Rains of Castamere is the most effective, I think,
right,
in what songs do, right? Propaganda and just the legend of the Lannisters is well encapsulated in that song, and it's definitely part of the story, I think.
Yeah, and it's one of the great scenes of music as well. Hearing, Catelyn sort of hearing the lyrics as the Red Wedding is happening, and not quite understanding what's happening, but the lyrics just give this dark foreboding, and you can just feel the hand of Tywin sort of closing around her throat, or closing around the throats of the Starks, even though she doesn't realize it. But that's a great that's a great scene, because you can feel music kind of driving that scene, like the thumping of the drums and the beating of her heart. It just kind of wraps into this really great scene of sort of dark musical horror.
Yes.
Well, as you suggested, Wilson, I think it's also that scene in particular is a really good encapsulation of what music does, because it conveys not only the tone and the sort of impulse behind the choice of that song, but also a lot of the history to us, because we don't get the history laid out for us except in, A History of Westeros, or, the sort of the backstory. But that song adds to Tywin in particular, and the Lannisters more generally, in a way that I'm hard pressed to think of anything in the actual narrative that conveys Tywin quite as well as the content of that song.
Precisely, well said. Just the story is in there with the defiance of the lesser lords and their words. A red lion is just as mean or fierce, and then Tywin's responses, and so he spoke, but where are they now? So I agree. I think of Tywin now as like Thanos. You guys have seen, he's doing wrong. I know, but it's like I'm trying to hate the guy, and I can't, because he's quite complex. But the story. Go ahead.
I think the song, it does convey a lot of values. It's this sort of harsh feudal, reinforcing this harsh feudal system that if you speak against, your superiors, you will be punished with extreme prejudice. But also this notion that history is written by the victors. Tywin won, so he gets to decide what the truth is. And if you go against him, you'll be resigned to, sad lyrics in a song that he is going to be singing forevermore.
Add a chapter to the song,
Yeah.
On the flip side, though, I feel like in the narrative, what we see, at least primarily through Tyrion's eyes, is a Tywin whose best days are behind him. On some, best, in a very qualified kind of sense, but that theme song for the Lannisters does feel on some level like ancient history, right? I don't know. It's still chilling, and it's still very suggestive and very evocative, but to me at least, it feels like a Tywin that never quite makes it into the present day that we're witnessing.
I think he's still pretty much on top right up until he dies, and the fact that song is being played while the Red Wedding is orchestrated shows that it still has that immense impact, and that he can keep recreating it against various lords that defy him. But I think the sentiment is kind of rendered hollow after his death, that, he was able to rule through terror and create obedience through terror. But once he's gone, it does kind of feel like ancient history. Like this, it feels like a hollow gesture that the terror was able to keep people in line to a certain extent. But once the source of the terror, once Tywin himself is gone, it all kind of falls apart. And nobody feels any particular great loyalty to the one who inspired terror.
Well, true. If Tywin had a worthy successor, like if Jaime had stepped up to be Tywin's, Tywin reborn, that song and the legend that followed his father would have served as wonderful preceding propaganda for him. But you're right. The song is more about Tywin than it is the justice of the Lannisters. It's more about him. So when he does die, it's hollow indeed. And that's why people start challenging, the power of the Lannisters. In Tywin's time, there were people who remembered the Tarbecks and the Rains. And, having the fact that not one of them is left, I think that does make Tywin this really formidable, lord that can change the landscape so drastically. The generation that starts with the story we read in A Game of Thrones, I think they are removed and all they have is the song and the legend. Yeah. So truly, that's the case there.
Although Jaime does use it famously in Book 4 when he's negotiating with Edmure, and he's in the bath and he gets the singer to play the Rains of Castamere while he's negotiating with him and describing the horrible things that will happen to Riverrun if he doesn't agree to this deal, and the fact that he'll return his child in a catapult. And one of the lines of Edmure is, please don't let him play that song, not that song, not that song. So it does. I mean, Jaime does actually make use of the song. Carries on that tradition of ruling through terror. But Jaime's kind of interesting because he actually, because we get that internal viewpoint, he is actually trying to work towards the greater good. Like he knows that everyone will die in the castle if it does come to that, so he's trying to frighten him so that doesn't happen, and use the reputation both of Tywin and of the Kingslayer for the greater good, which I guess maybe Tywin also thought he was working towards the greater good. So there's a bit of hypocrisy there, but the song is still in rotation in Westeros.
Yeah, I mean, for me it feels like, I don't know how to, like, almost like an anthem to the status quo, where this is the way that it has been done, and this is the way that Tywin has solved his problems, and he to keep coming back to it, to keep kind of replaying this greatest hit, I think is indicative of the way in which, especially the older characters, but some of the more kind of traditionalist younger characters like Cersei potentially are failing to evolve in the face of what for them are very uncustomary challenges, right? Like even winter coming, or things like that, where it's just, this has worked before, but there's a confidence that it will continue to work that I think is misplaced potentially. Yeah.
And it's the song's a bit of a double-edged blade for the Lannisters too, because they're like, we've ruled by the sword, but we also have to accept the fate that if we're defeated, this will be our fate. Like, it's this system's actually really toxic because they keep having to be on top and they keep having to rule through fear because they don't want to be the Rains of Castamere. And it kind of makes them paranoid. Well, it certainly makes Cersei paranoid to the point where she does actually just, help bring down her own house.
Yeah. Yes, that's true.
Did you have a favorite song in the series, Sarah?
I think that my favorite would have to be Jenny's song, and the Ghost of High Heart, listening to it, and her interaction with Arya in that chapter, and sort of her embodiment of that ghostliness and that tragedy and that suffering that that music can also encapsulate, right? So even though it's written by the winners in the case of something like the Rains of Castamere, that it still serves as a monument to the pain that came along with those events. Plus just the sort of tantalizing details about Summerhall. But yeah, I think that chapter is so beautiful when she's just listening and weeping and occupying this space of lament and beauty at the same time.
Yeah. Do we actually get the lyrics? I think we get a few snatches of lyrics of Jenny's.
Yeah, we do. We get kind of bit pieces, but we never get the whole thing.
Like
which is
the flowers in her hair.
And dancing with her ghosts and things. Yeah, but
is this in book 3?
Oh yeah, the Ghost of High Heart's in book 3, and she asks Lemoncloak for a rendition of the song. She calls it Jenny's song, but she refers to it as her Jenny, implying that she's like this, centuries old child of the forest that actually interacted with Jenny of Oldstones. But we also get a reference with Rob and Catelyn when they're looking at Oldstones, and Rob says, there used to be a song about Jenny with flowers in her hair, and Catelyn remembers, her and Littlefinger pretending to be Jenny and the Prince of Dragonflies. So it's like this very romantic song for young women in Westeros.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know if you need to know a lot about the history of Summerhall and the Duncan Egg stories to appreciate Jenny. I mean, they mention her in book 3, and the fact that she has foresight, where she has interpretations for like dreams. Yeah, makes her a relevant character in what's happening now, but. Otherwise, the story about Jenny is from the past. I don't know how much you have to know of the history to appreciate her. I don't know if this will all come back, but it sounds if you enjoy the history, then songs like Jenny's song and the others really do. They make the world real for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the only line that we get from the song, I guess, is high in the halls of the kings who are gone, Jenny would dance with her ghosts. And I think that even not knowing Summerhall, or even not knowing, which hall she's dancing in, the fact that it's so evocative of the past and this woman who has survived whoever her ghosts are, it invites speculation, but the speculation almost has to be of a tragic nature, right? That it's, things that are gone and only she's left to remember them. And I think that it speaks in many ways to your Poison Memories essay, Duncan, that we were talking about. But yeah, just that sense that especially women are left with nothing but ghosts to dance with, and that somehow that's still a romantic idea in this world.
Right.
Just speaks a lot to the sort of everyday brutality that's woven into it.
Yeah.
And the tragedy.
And it reminds me of something that Catelyn says at Oldstones, which is we're all just songs in the end. And it's like that existential idea that like looking at these old castles that are crumbling, these great mighty fortresses that have been empty for thousands of years, it kind of makes you feel like none of this is worth it. Like all that really survives is like our memory, and often the memories of those who've come before have survived purely on song, purely on this kind of oral tradition that the small folk recite to one another, because it contains some sort of like transcendent meaning. Like, so it's just something about Jenny's song that continually connects with people in Westeros, particularly women, it seems.
But I mean, isn't that almost the best case scenario for a lot? I mean, think about the number of people who, sort of are preserved only in the Maester's records, or not at all, right? Especially for the sort of the lower classes, and to be preserved as a song, or to be material for a song, is a kind of immortality that many of these people, the majority of these people, would never achieve.
Right.
So.
I wonder how much of the fact that the nobles, Tywin and Robb and all these other people, are so attached to these songs and these legends. I wonder how much of that proves really, fatalistic in the end, because they make decisions based on these, legends. Robb is making the decision to go on to King's Landing, and he thinks about Jenny and the kings before he decides to march on, and Tywin as well, and the fact that you either are the biggest baddest in Westeros, or you're not at all. I don't recall Littlefinger or Varys ever referencing a song when they play their games. So
that's so interesting.
Makes you wonder if, these folk who rely, or I shouldn't say rely, but the legend that these songs, perpetuate are so ingrained in their thinking of, their everyday thinking of how they make decisions, that it maybe causes them to act in ways that are not as practical as Littlefinger would act or Varys.
Yeah.
Well, Sansa is kind of the test case, or the extreme test case for that, right? Where that's all she thinks about, and that's all she uses as kind of a filter for understanding what's happening around her, and how incredibly detrimental that proves to her at first, and then ultimately how she starts to reject that as a workable paradigm or a reasonable way of understanding the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sansa's often put up as the character that has too romantic of a filter for the world. But I think all the Stark children to some extent have these very romantic notions of the world, whether it's romantic notions about what a knight is, or what a soldier is, or what a king is supposed to be, and they very quickly have those expectations upturned. I always remember that scene with Arya where she finds a little girl playing with a toy soldier, and then after Arya's been through all these traumatic events, she's witnessed the Red Wedding, she grabs the toy, rips its arms off, and says, "And now he looks like a real soldier."
Oh, shit.
Which is nice. It's a good way to make friends.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a great point, that Varys and Littlefinger are very unromantic. They're very sort of almost rational, that idea of the rational. These are the numbers. These are the troop strengths. This is how the world operates. This is the prejudices that we can exploit, or the customs that we can exploit. This is the way that information travels and can be manipulated. But I think another essay that we were going to look at, the Redgrass Fields, that reminds me of that scene where Daemon Blackfire spends an hour fighting this honorable duel with this knight, and then he spends the time to pack the defeated knight off for a funeral pyre, and in the meantime his forces have been obliterated. So he's it's that idea of, this is what a knight is. This is the romantic notion of how honor is performed on the battlefield. In the meantime, you've actually lost the war.
Yeah, it is true. My gosh, I think Damon was picturing the songs that would be made of the Redgrass Field when he was making some of these decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
He's like, this will make a fantastic song.
Yeah,
I'm going to get off my horse and let this guy walk away.
So, how is this?
Well, in contrast to the sniping from the hill that Bloodraven did, right? Where that is very ignominious, and it is very kind of backhanded and non-heroic long distance combat, and he won. He did. He did it. So
he did.
Well, isn't it? Is it Barristan that says Rhaegar fought nobly, Rhaegar fought honorably, Rhaegar lost? Moment. Oh, it's Jorah. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That he was honorable and he died. So,
yeah.
It's crazy. Robert was another one that wasn't for songs. I think he just smash heads and kick at. No, what's the saying?
He was for drinking songs.
He was drinking songs
and bawdy songs. He would have loved the Bear and the Maiden Fair.
Yeah, but yeah, truly.
Well, I did want to touch on the Bear and the Maiden Fair as well, because that's another, I think next to Rains of Castamere, that's the one that's performed the most in the books, because it's one of those good sort of tavern songs that different characters hear. But I think it's an interesting song on a metatextual level, because it sort of reflects this idea of this Beauty and the Beast kind of paradigm, which you see with various characters, like Sansa and the Hound, that idea of the bear. Jorah and Dany, Jorah is often referred to as the bear. He has this protective relationship with Dany, but Dany doesn't actually, feel the same way about him. Jaime and Brienne is kind of this switch, the Jaime's the beautiful one and Brienne's the ugly one, even though internally they're the opposite. And she famously has that scene with the bear where Jaime has to save her. So it's an interesting song that actually sort of works along the structure of the story.
Indeed. I tried to recall the lyrics for The Dornishman's Wife, but I can't. I know it's one of the Bordy songs indeed. But
the Dornishman wife, it's a fascinating one because it's made it all the way to Beyond the Wall. It's one of those songs that I guess it's because it's so sort of fun and bawdy and repeatable that it's actually that's how songs spread and that's how they permeate the culture. So there's this particular image of what a Dornishman is as the women being very fiery, or the men being very fiery and volatile, and the women being very seductive and whatever. That spread all the way, to the wildlings.
Yeah, I wonder how. I think I blame what's his name, Mansreda. I think he brought all the songs to the wildlings. Because how else would the Dornishman's wife make it Beyond the Wall?
Right.
If not Mons, yeah. But songs carry more than ravens,
To go back a bit to the pairings that are potentially reflected in the Bear and the Maiden Fair, I would suggest that John and Ygritte would be another. Right?
Who's the beauty there? I wonder.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, I almost think it's another switched one, like Jaime and Brienne, right? But that Ygritte is the kind of, I don't know. I guess it works both ways.
Well, I guess they're both kind of each other's beasts. Like John has this idea of wildlings as these savages, and Ygritte feels the same way about the Night's Watch. But when they're actually introduced to each other and get to know each other, they realize that those stereotypes aren't actually the truth. That the song presents a sort of a simplified version of the world.
Sure.
But the Bear and the Maiden Fair, it's also interesting because I think it sort of it seems like a fun kind of harmless song, but I think it sort of implants these sort of insidious values into the society, in the sense that it seems to be like not judging a book by your cover, like that's the theme of the song, but it has these weird allusions to the way that women are treated. It teaches this idea that men can't control themselves around beautiful women, and though they may kick and squeal, the woman will eventually relent and fall in love with you. So I think that idea of like the sort of the conquest is another thing that's permeated like the idea of what it means to be a man or a woman in Westerosi society.
Yeah, agreed.
I think my favorite song is The Last of the Giants, which is a wildling song, because I love the lyrics, but I also love that it takes place, unlike a lot of the other songs, it takes place from the perspective of the magical creatures and is actually very sympathetic towards them. It sort of contrasts with the other songs, which are all about, the Westerosi conquering, and it actually shows some of the effects of the conquering. It shows the point of view of some of the indigenous people of Westeros, or the excluded people. And it also works, on the sort of metatextual level, works as a nice allegory for the free folk. Like they've taken that song as kind of their mantra because they've felt, left behind in the midst of history, excluded from society or the country that they once called home.
Yeah.
Yes. When do we actually hear the song? Is it after the attack on the wall? Or is it before, when John is with the wildlings and he hears the song?
Yeah, I think it's before, when they're marching up to the wall.
So at that point, the giants are lamenting their very, very dwindling numbers. I think, what do they have? Like just a couple?
Well, I don't think it's a wildling song. I think like they're singing it. I don't think the giants can actually speak English. So John hears the wildling singing it, and he says, I don't know what he says, but he says something, and then Ygritte says, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." So it could be anything. But I think he says something about giants, and she says, "You don't know what you're talking about."
Doesn't he point out that there are still giants? So it's like a dumb song.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So it doesn't make sense because there are still plenty of giants. He's like, "You don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. This has meaning beyond the literal, Jon Snow."
Looking more closely at the lyrics too, I think it's very interesting to think about it as, if you think about the wildlings having more insights into the flaws of the quote unquote Southern societies, right? That if you think about the giant as a representative of the nobility, or kind of the old houses, and then read it from that perspective, right? Because it says like the small folk have stolen my forests, they've stolen my rivers and hills. These men who are small will never stand tall, while giants still walk in the light, right? That there's this there's the sense that there's an indignity to being overthrown by the small folk, right? By being questioned or challenged or hunted by this group that is so perceptibly inferior. But that is potentially like one of the outcomes that we're looking at as far as Daenerys wanting to completely upend the system, right? Like if she is going to eliminate these ancient houses that have been so confident in their, in their giant stature, like this is possibly a foreshadowing of that, particularly because the wildlings are so anathema to that kind of structure, right? That kind of hierarchy.
Yeah. And that's interesting because it also implies that men have to destroy the giants or the mythical creatures either physically or by just kind of excluding them from language, resigning them to myth, because they make them feel small, like they feel like they need to conquer them in body and mind. They need to rule everything. And this idea that there's magic that they can't control or that exceeds them is just intolerable to them. But also, that idea of the colonized people, like the giants and the children were colonized, and then the first men were colonized, and then the Andals were colonized by the Targaryens. So there's always this kind of dwindling people that have to die in order for the new generation to rule and become glorious or whatever. Like the first men have to dwindle into nothing in order for the Andals to thrive.
Yeah, indeed.
So is that a hopeful metaphor for progress in the case of overthrowing the big houses?
Yeah.
Is that a warning to the people who see that as progress if you're not incorporating or coexisting, that if your progress is predicated on the destruction of something else, like how much progress is that really?
Right. Well, yeah, I don't really see it as hopeful. I think it's sort of lamenting. Like it's like this is it's done. Like we're we might be alive, but we won't be alive for long. Like we're not propagating. There's no sort of future for our people. Seems to be the sentiment.
It's like a large scale version of exactly what we were saying about Tywin, isn't it? Where like this works as long as I'm on top, but as soon as there's someone more numerous or more determined or stronger in some respect, then where has this really gotten me, this progress that I'm pursuing?
Right. And it's interesting in the Bran chapter, the last Bran chapter, where he interacts with the children of the forest, which is coming up in the next reread, I think. They sort of describe, they've actually interacted with the giants, and they describe a vision of Westeros that precedes even the first men. Like they describe the lions that used to prowl the Westerlands, and they describe the giants and all of these creatures that have been made extinct or resigned to cages in order to facilitate the humanity.
How ironic that so many of those mythical creatures are then appropriated as sigils for those houses, right?
Yeah.
The lion even, or the Colossus, isn't it, is Littlefinger's like legitimate sigil, and the direwolf, obviously, right? That these are all things that have been appropriated and or arguably misappropriated and removed from their original context.
They've been tamed. They no longer have their own like sense of being or sense of history. They've been retained and sort of absorbed into the colonial representation.
Well, and I think that was the case with the dragons too, until Daenerys, right, where they had become this kind of almost hollow symbol of a more elemental existence, and then suddenly there are real, honest to God, dragons back in the world, and what does that mean for the people who hide behind pictures of dragons or the idea of dragons?
I guess you could see the the return of magic to the world as a potential for these powers to reemerge. I mean, we have seen giants reemerging in the story. We have seen dragons reemerging in the story, and that is the storyline in Book 5, that she uses the dragons essentially as a symbolic, as a symbol, as a banner, but cages the actual creatures up.
Yeah.
But then at the end, she kind of realizes what she's done and lets loose and mounts the dragon and takes into the air and uses it as a physical being. So maybe it isn't the last of the dragons or the last of the giants. Maybe they will see a return.
Well, after the wall, I don't know how many giants we have left. after the attack on the wall. I've become my brain has split between the show and the book, so I can't recall if there are actually giants left after the attack on the wall.
Well, the giant is the star of like the final chapter of book 5. He rips apart one of the Black brothers.
True.
Yeah.
But he's the last one, is he? Like, that's the one giant left alive, undead.
The one giant.
Yeah, one. I can't say the entire thing.
110. He's a binary giant.
Yes.
I'm sure there's some others out there.
You think so?
Hodor's at least half giant.
Indeed. Well, hopefully he remains that way for, through book 7. We'll see. Indeed.
So there's not many other... I mean, we hear lots of songs, like, mentioned, but there's only a few that actually have lyrics. So we've mentioned some of them. Then there's the Mother's Hymn, the Song of the Seven. There's actually, it's interesting, we actually hear, like, a new song, which is the Battle of Blackwater. The Battle of Blackwater,
mm-hmm.
which is some of which is performed at Joffrey's wedding, I think. And it sort of paints Stannis as this, this brooding villain trying to kill his brother's son and take what's rightfully his. So again, it's that idea of the victor is the one who writes history and paints in these sort of broad archetypes which appeal to the authorized narrative.
Yeah, the Battle of Blackwater, the song talks about not Tyrion, but Joffrey and Cersei and their courage during the battle. So that's obviously propaganda right there.
Yeah.
So it's one of the new ones. It'll be interesting to see how many new songs come out and how they distort the facts as we know them as readers, and how they will serve the story moving forward in different places.
That's very interesting that we have now spent enough time in this world, or we've sort of spanned enough time that we are starting to share in the characters' retrospectives on them. Like, I'm thinking about the play version of Robert's death that Arya watches, right? That it's starting to have been long enough ago that we will be getting these echoes, and as you say, like, we will be in a position to judge and gauge the accuracy or the spin that comes out of those events, which I think is fascinating on a kind of meta-narrative level.
And the other little rhymes we get are Patchface's creepy limericks that he sort of spouts off at inappropriate times.
F that guy.
Which seems
He's
like
the worst.
Which seems like nonsense, but a lot of readers have sort of looked further into it and realized he's potentially prophesizing various events.
That actually raises, Duncan, a point that I wanted to kind of follow up on that you raised also in your summary, and that's the question of the fool's license, right? That affords to singers as well. And I was wondering what you guys thought about as far as like the distinctions between fools and singers with respect to that license. Like, do we see a kind of a clear dividing line between like how licensed fools are and how licensed singers are, or do you think they're pretty much in the same category?
I think the categories often merge. I think Tom Seven's streams, he makes like up a funny song that's mocking Edmure, was it? Yeah, like the floppy fish, like making fun of this time that Edmure went to a brothel and couldn't perform, and Edmure just has to grimace and bear it, even though he obviously has way more power than the singer. So I think, like if it's done, it's sort of, if it's done satirically, or if the song is poking fun at someone, it can often, they often are protected in that way. It's probably different if they wrote like a war ballad, for the Blackfires or something like that. That might not be tolerated. Well, the other famous example, I guess, is who was the singer in King's Landing that wrote the song "The Hands of Gold"? I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, yeah. Well.
It doesn't matter because he's
oh my god.
What do you say?
Senor Stew.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's Lunch, that's his name. But he famously threatens Tyrion with a song and is promptly disposed of.
disposed of.
So they're not necessarily always protected. But I mean, that's a pretty specific example where he's actually threatening Tyrion to his face. That's a bit different from, just a song that has these, allusions to something that could mean anything. Although Joffrey, I think he offs a few singers that were making fun of the Lannisters. So it could go either way. I guess it depends on the Lord. And the singer or the fools, like wit, they have to be a bit subtle about what they're saying.
Have we seen any fools punished or done away with
in the current series, the Song of Ice and Fire series?
No.
The only fool I can think of is Patchface. I can't think of any fool that's actually
Butterbumps.
Yeah, well, Moonboy. No, I can't think of any fools that are punished. I mean, they're usually pretty popular. Like they're protected by their popularity. Like everyone at court loves them.
Yeah.
And they're very entertaining. Like there's not that much entertainment in Westeros. You can't get rid of prime time. You can't cancel. It'd be like canceling a whole channel.
Indeed.
It's just interesting. The singers on some level, or at least ostensibly, are dealing with more serious material, or their material has potentially more serious ramifications, and that is a much more high risk profession than, or it seems to be, even though they overlap so much. I don't know, it just struck me as interesting.
Oh, true. Well, if you moving forward, it'll be interesting to see how much singers would influence the story that we are reading now to, let's say, a generation that's 200 years removed, just like singers inform the maesters about the Dance of Dragons, even fools. What's his name? The fool that was in the Red Keep during the Dance of Dragons. His story is part of the
Mushroom.
The actual
Mushroom. Yeah, I just looked him up too. Yeah, that's.
We rely on what he says, and some of it is, fictitious, but then some facts are made so because of his testimony corroborating, said events. So they are important, and they do influence how we see the world. Indeed, how much of their account is true, only God knows.
Well, Mushroom's a funny example where he presents the sort of craziest version of the scenario, and that's inevitably the version that gets repeated because it's the most fun to be repeated by the small folk. And you see that, I guess, in modern times with Stannis's daughter being fathered by a fool. That's the sort of the small folk delight in telling it, is what Davos says. And Amin sort of points this out in the essay. It creates this interesting dynamic between these kinds of official accounts of history, the sort of maesterly account, I guess, which is facts and figures and dates and troop numbers and the years of a particular reign of king and the line of succession, and then these kind of folk accounts of the past. What did the battle look like? What did it feel like? What was the weather like? What was, just that dramatic telling, the sensorial, the emotions behind events rather than just the facts. And often, I guess, folk accounts maybe are popular because, well, small folk are often illiterate. Oral tradition predates the written word.
Well, I think we also see, or we have seen already, points in which the maesters are less reliable than some of the other accounts that we get, right? Whether there's, a Citadel conspiracy and they're actually redacting things, or whether, they're overly pragmatic in a world that does have room for magic and mysterious happenings and things like that, or they're like, the small folk report, blah, blah, blah. But of course we know that that's not true. And there's this very kind of euhemeristic approach to that can't be what really happened. But in fact, we've seen that could be what happened, right?
Yeah,
true.
I mean, the small folk are more than prone to exaggerations, and we hear about Renly arriving at the Battle of Blackwater and Renly's ghost and defeating his brother. Obviously, the folk songs are full of inaccuracies and crazy superstition. But I guess the perception is that the maesters are often beholden to high lords, beholden to official accounts of histories and things like that. But songs for everyday people have to respect their perspective. Otherwise, they're not necessarily going to be popular or going to be listened to. They have to reflect their perspective, their customs. They're specific to particular regions. So there's that chapter in A Feast for Crows where Brienne is traveling through the Riverlands. I guess it's a few chapters, and she hears these sort of these local stories about Crackclaw Points, and she offers her local stories or her local heroes from. Oh my God, I'm forgetting everything in A Song of Ice and Fire. Where is she from? Tarth. From Tarth. And yeah, they're comparing these stories that they grew up on, these rhymes and these songs, and which inform their values. And Amin actually pointed this out in the forums, that some songs kind of change from region to region. So you have this song about, I'm off to Goldtown, and then you have another song, I'm off to Ashford. So it's sort of, some of the details change over time. Even if the notes are the same and repeated, some of the lyrics might be adapted by the singer from place to place. I guess you gotta play to the crowd.
Yeah.
Indeed. Indeed.
That's most of what I had. I guess my last question is, and I guess it's a pretty big question, what is the song in A Song of Ice and Fire? Because we only get one reference to it in the book, but it's spoken by Rhaegar of all people in one of Dany's visions in the House of the Undying, and I guess he refers to something called the Prince Who Was Promised, who we have no idea who that is at the time at least, and then he says, and here's the prince that was promised, and his is the Song of Ice and Fire. And I always get a chill down my spine whenever they say the title of the book in the book, or the title of the movie in the movie. I'm like, oh my God, that's the title of the movie. But this, it's a pretty general, it could apply to any number of things. It's a very elemental kind of reference. Do you guys have any theories on what I might refer to?
I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole on this one, but I do, that scene, that particular vision that she has does my head in a little bit, because if he is in fact speaking, as most people assume he is, to his wife, because he's not present at the Tower of Joy when Lyanna gives birth, right? Because he's at the ford. Then why that child and not Jon? Why would that conversation have taken place with respect to that baby and that wife if then he felt like he had to pursue Lyanna as the ice part of Ice and Fire, right? Which is also generally accepted that Jon is the union of those two, right? So it just doesn't, unless because it's a vision, those elements are conflated. But do you understand what I'm asking?
I do. You get the sense from that particular vision, and it does look like a mashup of various bits and pieces. I don't know if George does that intentionally to keep us guessing, because, otherwise just show us the dream and him saying, I am the Song of Ice and Fire and these are my 3 kids. But it sounds like, it sounds like Rhaegar is guessing as to the significance of, the union between Ice and Fire. And so he's talking to Ilaria, in the dream that Daenerys has, that he says there has to be 3, and then I think that's what turns him to Lyanna, because he's looking for a 3rd, and so we go there, and hence the song. But if you ask me, the Song of Ice and Fire almost seems like it's talking about Rhaegar himself being the prince that was promised, but not actually fulfilling his destiny. Not because the prophecy said so, but because Robert happened. And so I don't know. If my guess would be Rhaegar would be the song, because he seems to be at the center of it all,
Well, he seemed to, Barristan seemed to imply that at one point Rhaegar thought he was the prince that was promised, and that's why he gave up the harp and took up the sword. But then later down he realized that he was only in the line of the prince that was promised, and he had to make it happen by finding a Stark wife or something. It's hard to figure out whether it means a literal union between the Targaryens and the Starks, or if it's more of a prophetic union between the elements of Ice and Fire. We do. I don't think the Targaryens and the Starks have ever married or ever wedded. There was at one point a pact between, and it was actually called the Pact of Ice and Fire, and it was during the Dance of the Dragons, and it was if the Starks supported the Blacks, they would marry into the royal family, but it never happened.
It never happened.
It never came to fruition. So it hasn't been fulfilled yet. He's referring to Aegon, but I mean, I guess the idea would be, well, maybe Aegon's the prince that was promised. I doubt it, but maybe. But I guess the idea would be that he's misinterpreted the prophecy, and the prince that was promised hasn't actually been born. Either it's Jon or maybe it's Dany. Like, that's the connection, that she's the actual prince that was promised, and that's why she's seeing the vision.
Right, but so I guess my question would be, like, why, even if he has misinterpreted it, why would his child with a Dornish wife be the Song of Ice and Fire? Like, why would his song be the Song of Ice and Fire? And I guess that only is a problem if you're referring to lineage rather than deeds or whatever. But it just seems very
I mean, like, where's the ice? Center. Yeah, where's the ice in this ingredient?
Exactly. Like sand and fire.
Yeah.
Song of Sand and Fire. Yeah.
Alternate title. Yeah.
But maybe the ice is referring to the danger north. Yeah. Maybe that is the ice, and the fire being the Targaryens, their relevance to meeting that threat. I don't know how much of the threat was, perceived in Rhaegar's time. We start the book after Rhaegar, and we know the first chapters of the Game of Thrones is the threat, that ice that is up north. So I don't know.
That's the thing. Yeah. It might not be a harmony. It might be a collision. It might be the battle between ice and fire. And that, in that sense, it takes on the broader definition of, like, the whether it's the dragons versus the White Walker, or whether it's like warm-blooded humans versus the cold-blooded others. It could mean anything really. Martin actually does give an answer about it. It's not a real answer, but a kind of allusion to it, where he's saying, like, it is this kind of binary between hot and cold. So it's fire is love, fire is passion, fire is sexual ardor, and all of these things. Ice is betrayal, ice is revenge, ice is ... that kind of cold inhumanity and all that stuff that is being played out in the books. So you could see the song as this interplay between various hot and cold passions between the characters in a sort of a metatextual level.
I mean, I can definitely see how that makes sense, but then why, if that's how Rhaegar was reading it, then why pursue Lyanna specifically to such an extreme detriment, right? Like against all kind of reasonable expectations, and I don't know. Like I said, it does my head in a little bit if you really start thinking about, like, him having that conversation with that wife about that child. It just doesn't make sense, and maybe that's the point. But all of the other visions that she has are on point if you read them metaphorically, and this one just seems flawed, whereas the other ones don't. And that's just part of what kind of nags at me about. Yeah, like I said, I don't want to take us too far down the rabbit hole, but it is something that I lie awake at night.
Worry.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Book 7 will answer that question, because you're right. It's not. We only have part of the picture. We don't have it all. So maybe at the conclusion of Book 7, I think we'll get a good sense of where Dany, Aegon, and maybe even Jon fit into the whole song. The song is not done yet. So,
as far as the actual terminology, Duncan, I always took it as essentially an equivalent word for epic, right? Like the epic of Ice and Fire. And right. I mean, that betrays my Anglo-Saxon proclivities, I guess, but
yeah. That makes sense. And Amin talks about that, it is a great sort of ballad. It's like a great Homeric legend, I guess, like the Iliad or something like that, this sweeping saga. And you could even see it as having some of the structure of music, these different perspectives, these different characters coming together and fighting and dispersing and uniting, and these kind of, the story will sort of swell at certain points and then disperse, and it does, have some of those rhythms, I guess, and music is used so often. There's this clash between history and songs and the way people are remembered, and so music is very much part of the veins of the story. Each family, I guess, has a particular theme that they're playing to, that's played before them, and they're trying to continue on. Catelyn says our songs extend beyond our life. That's the only thing that's left to us. So it is this idea of memory and legends and all that kind of epic stuff.
Well, and I think too that a song by its very nature has, as you suggested before, that oral component and that performative component, which gives it a kind of immediacy each time it's performed, and it also gives it a living quality that something like a history of Ice and Fire or even a story of Ice and Fire wouldn't necessarily, because you can transcribe a story, you can commit it to paper and kind of leave it there, and you can annotate music. I mean, you can record it, but you can't ever hear it on paper, right? That there's an additional kind of immediate real life component to a song.
It's a living, changing, transforming thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not written down, it's not pinned down, it's always being retold and reenacted and performed and re-embroidered from generation to generation. But it is funny because Martin actually, he uses the word song in several of his works. Like he released a compendium called, the Songs of, Shadows and Mist or something like that, like a collection of short stories. And one of his most famous short stories is A Song for Lyre. So he keeps coming back to this. The Songs of the Dying Earth, I think, is this this book that he contributed to. So he likes the word song. He likes that romantic aspect to his titles.
I mean, to touch on our points earlier about the mythical creatures and things, I think that I would argue that stories and histories and things like that are exclusive to humans. There's something that humanity, that characterizes humanity, but birds have songs and other animals have songs in a way that even without a spoken language, it's still something that's used to communicate and to convey meaning and to preserve knowledge and I don't know. I think it's interesting that it would extend in that respect, like beyond the sort of even the immediate humanity of our protagonists and their points of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you want to get philosophical, it could be like, the essence of a thing. Like, a tree has a song, a rock has a song. It's like, what is it in itself beyond it's the way it's perceived? And yeah, like when we get to the Children of the Forest with Bran, they refer to themselves not as the Children of the Forest, but those who sing the songs of the earth. So it's that idea of getting in touch with the essence of something. I think that's everything I've got to say. The last point is the singer's name was Simon Silvertongue. No need to tweet at us or angrily comment in YouTube. We do know.
Thank you.
I just temporarily forgot. I'm sorry. All right. We might move on to our next essay. Sarah, would you like to tell us about Harrenhal?
Sure. In this essay, The Curse of Harren the Black, Aziz and Ashaya of History of Westeros take a close look at the history of what is probably the Seven Kingdoms' most notorious piece of real estate, Harrenhal. They consider some real-world inspirations for the awesomely huge, blood-soaked stronghold, including Pontefract or Pomfret Castle in England. And then they move on to the centrality of Harrenhal, both in the geography of Westeros and in the narrative. They review its origins as the monument to the hubris of Harren the Black, the ironborn conqueror of the Riverlands, its immediate decimation by Aegon the Conqueror and Balerion the Black Dread, and its subsequent history as the seat of a number of ill-fated houses, including House Coharis, House Haraway, House Towers, House Strong, House Lothson, and House Went, as well as its infamous role as the setting of the Tourney of the False Spring, the events of which planted the seeds for Robert's Rebellion. They also review its prominence during the events of A Song of Ice and Fire, as the castle is occupied by Tywin Lannister, the Mountain Gregor Clegane, Roose Bolton, and Virgo Hoat, as well as given to Janos Slynt and most recently Peter Baelish, who, though he has yet to set foot in it, uses it to leverage his marriage with Lysa Arryn, thus gaining at least nominal control of the Riverlands and the Eyrie. Aziz and Ashaya also speculate as to the future of Harrenhal in the hands of Littlefinger and its potential role in Sansa or Arya's future storylines. Finally, they explore some real-world explanations for the persistence of belief in the Harrenhal curse, including its awe-inspiring scale, the grisly fates met by the majority of its occupiers, the violent and, from the outside, often inexplicable violence and tragedy that haunts its grounds, and the particularly extraordinary nature of figures from its past, like Mad Danelle Lothson and Harren himself. Ultimately, they conclude, quote, Harrenhal isn't cursed. It is the curse, end quote.
Dun, dun.
That's appropriate. It's an appropriate, yeah.
It's a good line.
It is. My gosh. So would Harrenhal be one of the characters, one of these big pillars of the world of Ice and Fire, because it's there, the conquest. It's a rallying point through the War of the Five Kings. It's a symbol of legitimacy in Littlefinger's games with the various. And it's supposed to be one of the richest. I've heard it say that its incomes are quite substantial. So, and it's right there in the center of the entire story. It seems to me like one of the big characters. I wonder if George was intentional when he brought many of his characters there, like Arya coming through Harrenhal on her way, and so forth. Maybe you guys see symbolism there that's profound, maybe on several rereads, after several rereads.
Yeah, I mean it is one of the big four castles of the story: Winterfell, Castle Black, King's Landing, and Harrenhal, which you don't think of because it is very much like a transitional location. Several characters pass through Harrenhal, but they don't necessarily stay there for a long time. I guess Arya stays there for at least half of book 2. But it is, it's ideally it's centrally located to the war, so a lot of people pass through it. But it has a very bad reputation. It's as both a place of violence, but also as a place that's just completely unmanageable, just unreasonably big, unreasonably empty, just this white elephant that just keeps getting passed from lord to lord, this inconvenient monstrosity that, just kind of haunts the surrounding region.
Well, one of the things I wanted to talk about with you guys is what you thought about the predictions that they make in the essay, especially about Littlefinger's potential to manage that unmanageability, right? Like to kind of make money appear from nowhere, as he seems to have done in King's Landing. But whether you do share their vision of Littlefinger with a Riverlander army behind him, or kind of Littlefinger ensconced and ruling from Harrenhal with any kind of real permanence. Do you have high hopes for Littlefinger's scheming, I guess, is the
is the question.
I can't see him ever going there, because he seems to believe the curse is real as well. And like, why would anyone follow? I mean, I guess if it's between Littlefinger and the Freys, maybe he can get some support in the Riverlands. But I think he's far more ideally placed in the Eyrie, much richer lands, much less, ravished by the war, in a much more stable position, particularly to create an alliance with the North.
I agree.
I feel like it depends very heavily on what aspect of Littlefinger manages to take over, in the sense that on one hand he is extremely pragmatic and he is very very strategically minded, and Duncan, I totally agree that I think he's in a much better position in the Eyrie as far as strategy goes, but he does have that little man syndrome, right? That he wants to prove that he is better than everyone and that he can do things that other people can't do, and that these lords who looked down on him and kind of mocked him in his youth were mistaken. And so, I mean, if that hubris and that kind of wounded ego that he's carrying around that motivates so much of what he does is the dominant part of him, like I can almost see him being like, I'm going to move into Harrenhal and I'm going to make it great. And I'm going to, do the things that nobody's been able to do. And I would just love to see that happen, because either it works or it doesn't, and it's just this incredibly epic fail. But either way, I think it would be.
Oh, I wish Littlefinger was that predictable. He is very sly. Harrenhal is too central, I think. I don't see him ever being that visible or wanting to be that visible where he takes up residency in Harrenhal. Like you say, the Eyrie is more suitable to his maneuverings as far as resources and such. But also, the end goal, it seems to me, for Littlefinger, as much as I can predict what he's doing, is the eradication of all these lords. Maybe those who slighted him first, Jon Arryn and Stark and so forth, but then to lordship as a whole in Westeros. I think he hates that the status quo or the feudal system. So Harrenhal, maybe he does believe the curse, or he sees that as a symbol of the dominance of lordship, and so maybe not a desired price for him, according to the books,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and also Littlefinger, he strikes me as a person who sort of makes use of the systems that are already in place. Like, he doesn't necessarily build things from scratch, which is what he'd have to do with Harrenhal. Like, he's assumed power in the Eyrie because there was a structure in place with the Arryns that he's manipulated it and sort of inserted himself into, and that sort of acquired him a sense of legitimacy. So he's used Harrenhal to be a legitimate Lord Paramount of the Riverlands or whatever, which is weird that he's Lord Paramount, but he doesn't actually do anything in the Riverlands. Anyway, maybe it's got to the
weird,
phrase. Yeah, it's all a bit weird. But yeah, he's just inserted himself in there. It's just sort of convenient for the lords to say, he's taken over the castle. If you want me, you're going to have to root me out. They don't want a war. It's just easier for them to give him a year to sort of put things in order, groom Robert, sort of set Lysa's mistakes in order. Whereas Harrenhal, that'd be a momentous job for not really as much benefit. I mean, I guess that is the thing. He could try and prove himself. Like, all of these great families, none of them could hold on to Harrenhal. I'm going to build a dynasty that would actually. I'm going to renovate it. I'm going to finally fix the roof. Take down the burnt towers, build some new ones. Although I could imagine him rebuilding Harrenhal and then Dany just swooping in and setting it on fire.
It's like, surprise!
And then a sad horn. But no, I think the more I think of it, and it's only just occurred to me, but Littlefinger is a Vale native, and he sort of grew up in the mud in the Fingers, but he's probably always looked up at the Vale as this great city, castle in the clouds. He's probably idealized it. I guess we think it's more about him just kind of using the Vale as a strategic device, a way to set Sansa up for power, try and, woo her or whatever. But I think part of it might be that he is trying to prove himself and take this, castle in the clouds that he's looked up at. I don't think Harrenhal has that same kind of nostalgia for him.
For him, yeah. Did he ask for Harrenhal, or was it given to him by Tywin? To make him more lordly.
It was first offered by Tyrion, I think. He sort of, he offers it, and Littlefinger quickly says, that castle's cursed. Why would I want that? But Tyrion sees like a little glint in his eye and realizes that's what he wants. So I think it's reward for brokering the alliance between the Lannisters and the Tyrells. I think Tyrion sends him out to Bitterbridge to try and make some kind of alliance, and that was his reward. I mean, Tywin would obviously have to okay it, but he's been a pretty good friend to the Lannisters, so I think that was roundly agreed upon.
That was okay. For some reason, I thought it was Tywin who gave it over to him to make him more respectable.
Right.
So he could marry Lysa. Yeah,
I think that's why he wanted it, right? But then
maybe I'm misremembering. I mean, Tyrion definitely offers it first, but I'm not sure when it was formally.
That I recall as well. Just how it ended up in his hands, I don't remember either. Do you know who had Harrenhal before him? Like right before him?
The Wentz.
Before Peter. The Wentz.
Yeah, Lady Went had it at the beginning, at the end of A Game of Thrones, but I think she was a widower, and she didn't have any remaining heirs, and she didn't have enough soldiers to hold Harrenhal, so she gave it over to Tywin to use as a base of operations, something like that.
Yeah.
And I think she died subsequently, so like the line pretty much has ended on the Wents, so that the Lannisters essentially own it at that point.
Yeah. Although the chapter pointed out that all of the Stark children are Wents by blood on their maternal side. Their maternal grandmother is a Went.
Yeah.
So that theoretically any of them would have some claim to it, which was also an interesting aspect of Littlefinger's, ostensible possession of it, was that he also has Sansa, who, aside from Bran, has the most immediate blood claim to it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I had forgotten that detail until I reread this, but yeah. And then that is also sort of interestingly highlighted by the rumor about Sansa after the Purple Wedding, which they also point out in the chapter. But one of the rumors that's flying around is that the Northern girl, Winterfell's daughter, we heard she killed the king with a spell and afterwards changed into a wolf with big leather wings like a bat and flew out a tower window, but she left the dwarf behind and Cersei means to have his head. But so that there's even in this particular rumor, there are elements of this curse that have attached themselves to Sansa, ostensibly, even though she has never been there, and but that imagistically, like the wings of the bat connect her pretty firmly to Harrenhal specifically.
Yeah, it's sort of assumed this almost like Castle Dracula vibe. Like there's these stories about some of the former lords would bathe in virgin's blood and take the form of bats and fly off and steal children away from the forest.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it seems a bit too central to be like a Castle Dracula. Like that always seemed like a remote kind of castle. Like I always associated that more with like the Dreadfort. The Boltons were more like these vampire figures. But I do like that. Yeah, that really gothic lore has attached to the castle, and just the look of the castle just looks so haunted and so horrible and so empty, and just you can just imagine horrible things happening, and then they are, manifested there.
Yeah, they do in the chapter, and then sort of more extensively just in the history itself. Like there are very bizarre, very consistently bizarre things that happen, and sort of, if any one of them happened, it would be unfortunate, but there's this collective accumulation of just terrible things happening to anyone who holds it that happens throughout the history. So the idea that I guess the Coharis line, they spontaneously combusted, or like servants would spontaneously combust and they just like find them the next morning in ashes. And then that's one of the Coharis who finally loses it. He practiced the rite of first night. And so one of the fathers of one of the brides that he helped himself to opened the gate, and they left him gelded and bled to death. That the Strongs burnt to death in the tower. That there are rumors of, as we said, like Matt Donnell bathing in virgin's blood, and changing into, or sending a giant bat to go collect children to eat and things like that. That like there are just the sense in which, as I said, like any one of those things, like maybe there's a crazy lady who lives there and like there are stories about her, but the castle itself is okay. But there's this accumulation of horrors that keeps happening. And then obviously like everything that happens when Arya is there, right? Like just the occupations of the mountain to begin with, and then Yergo Hoat, and like just all of the kind of tortures and things that go on. It almost seems to be self-perpetuating, where like, we're in Harrenhal and it's such a horrible place that there's kind of settle there.
Yeah, I mean, the Harrenhal we see in the contemporary series is a horrible place, but I guess we assume it's a horrible place because it's full of horrible people, like the Mountains Men, the bloody mummers, everything that Arya sees is filtered through the chaos of war. But it wasn't always like that. Like there were, noble families who did try and make a go of, restoring it and trying to make it a habitable place, a part of the, one of the great castles of Westeros. And, you get things like the tourney of Harrenhal, which at its time was quite considered one of the greatest tourneys ever thrown. All the, all the who's who of Westeros were attending. It was pretty glamorous, but that again ended in tragedy, kicked off this civil war. So it does genuinely seem like a lot of, it's called cursed because a lot of bad things can be sort of traced back to it or occur within its walls.
That was, I guess, one of my questions in reviewing the history is that, yes, in fact, there are a lot of terrible things that happen, but at least in my impression, when something is cursed, it's usually cursed by someone, right? Or by something, that there's a kind of single precipitating event that then sends echoes out as this subsequent series of mishaps. And so my question was like, what is the origin of this particular curse, right? I mean, like, obviously we know the first terrible thing that happens is that it's melted on literally the day that Harren moves in after 40 years of construction, right? Like that's the first bad thing, right? I know, yeah, totally. But why a curse specifically? Like, does he curse it and say?
I just imagine him putting out the welcoming mat and cutting the lawn for the first time, checking his mail. Goes inside to read the paper. Ding dong.
Like straightening a vase of flowers on the table.
Yeah. He just looks up and sighs. What a great castle I've built. Who could be at the door? Come in there.
Honey, do you know an Aegon? Aegon the Conqueror? I don't know any Aegon.
Oh, thank you. We don't want any. We've already got one.
Sarah's asking a question.
What are you selling? Sorry.
Yeah. Who's Jehovah? No. It's like So the Seven Kingdoms is built on the burning of Harrenhal. It's the first move. Well, maybe not the first move, but it's symbolic. Aegon built the Seven Kingdoms through fire and blood, and Harrenhal stands as a testament forever and ever that this is how this kingdom was made. Fire and blood. So you either submit or you get roasted alive in your nice big castle. And so maybe that's the curse, that the Seven Kingdoms are destined to never to be a true kingdom, always to be marred in blood and fighting. And that's what it has been since Aegon's day, to keep the Seven Kingdoms together, rebellion after rebellion. They'll never be truly one united kingdom. Maybe that's the, the explanation there, or the I don't know, these metaphysical or the literary sense of the curse of a literary meaning, of the curse of Harrenhal. But maybe that's it. And then from then on, all the big decisions, the big meetings, the tourney at Harrenhal, even the Great Council, the one that decided who rules, were all at Harrenhal. Maybe just because it's a big space, but then monumental decisions and fatal ones seem to originate from Harrenhal. Always.
Yeah, I guess if anyone cursed it, it was Aegon the Conqueror, because he says, at dawn your line will end, or something like that, and that it almost feels like those words have echoed down to each sort of family that's occupied it. All of their lines seem to have ended. I can't think of any family that's held it that's still in existence. Like the Strongs are extinct, the Wents I think are extinct.
Well, they're Manisa's kid, right? Like the Stark kids are arguably Wents on there.
The blood continues, but
not the direct line.
Yeah, the direct line, which doesn't bode well for Littlefinger. Hopefully, Sansa's removed enough that it doesn't affect her too much. But it's also like a cautionary tale, I guess. It's like Harren the Black, he flew too close to the sun. He was too prideful. And it's almost like the gods cursed him, something like that. I guess you could also see it as like he was considered extremely brutal to the Riverlanders. Maybe, they cursed him, like the thousands that died building the castle, they put the curse on him, kind of like the slaves of Valeria cursed Valeria for what they'd done to them, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And it's related to one of the points I think that also comes up in the chapter, that it was built, like one of the kind of key ingredients, like the architectural ingredients of Harrenhal is weirwood. And that the weirwood tree in the Godswood is particularly maleficent in its face, and it, the wounds that Daemon left, like, bleed and things every spring. And so I wonder if it isn't echoes of a similar kind of thread that we've seen coming up in other aspects, that the curse is of the land itself, right? So that it's not just arrogance in the sense of trying to build the biggest castle or stretching yourself beyond conceivable resources, but specifically of trying to exert an impossible level of control over Westeros itself, like over the land and the nature, and how appropriate that it would be melted by fire rather than just crumble or be structurally unsound due to, like, architectural error. But so maybe the curse comes from the appropriation or kind of attempt at dominance that it represents over, like, that it's built on the shore of the God's Eye, right? And that it's made of the sacred wood, and so maybe that's a part of it too. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. There's something unnatural about it. It shouldn't exist. Like it depleted the resources of the land. It destroyed the land in order to be constructed in some sense. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about whether it's literally cursed, like in the supernatural sense or not, because, like, magic obviously exists in this world, so it's not impossible. But I mean, Aziz and Ashaya make the point that it's cursed insofar as people believe the curse is real and act accordingly. So if you think it's cursed, then you're going to act like it's cursed. But I think also as like a site of, like, historic trauma, it could be the case that generations of people who live there or the region are just kind of haunted by this unresolved sense of the violence or the atrocities that have been committed there. That the past deeds of a family kind of haunt them. The knowledge of the violence that's been carried out in the walls affects residents, maybe not supernaturally, but psychologically, and also just the structure of the building, the sheer size of it, the emptiness of it, the morbidity of seeing the melted towers, combined with the knowledge of the terrible things that have happened. It's got to have an effect on the psyche, conjures up feelings of the memories of suffering, that isolation can change people. People talk about being isolated in remote locations, going crazy or falling into this existential despair. I can imagine that kind of contributing to some of the behavior of some of the families.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Also, I was reading about like haunted houses, and one of the kind of I guess the scientific explanations was that some haunted houses might contain sort of bad chemicals that people have been exposed to, like in the walls. And I was wondering if some of the strange unnatural chemicals that were used to construct Harrenhal might have some weird hallucinatory or mental effect on some of the inhabitants.
Oh, weird.
Or even the dragon fire, like the magic that was produced by the dragon, melting those walls, like the mixture of the magical fire and some of the toxins that were put in the walls. The weirwood, what happens when you burn weirwood with dragon fire? Does that create
some kind of radioactive isotope left over from...
I mean,
it's a fire.
Yeah, it's a bit of a crackpot theory, but that idea of like radiation or toxicity in the air creating hallucinations.
Well, I mean, we have sort of a potential reinforcement of that idea from the oily stone, don't we? From the oily black stone, and particularly in the city. I can't think of it now, but that's completely
Ashaya.
Constructed. That's completely constructed of that, and that did have very similar issues with fertility and
right.
Or infertility and an entire dead civilization, basically. That
I think,
that's very interesting.
Black waters and eyeless fish.
That there is something potentially radioactive or whatever about it, but I wonder if we can trace the weirdness of that oily black stone to something like the fused stone that they create with dragonfire, like whether there is a kind of network of actual elemental issues that people.
Well, now I'm starting to be convinced, because if there's any equivalent to like a nuclear bomb, it's a dragon. So you could imagine these sites as radioactive and producing weird defects in the people that live there.
Yeah.
And that was such a payload of dragonfire at that location.
I think it was the only time he released all 3 dragons, right? So
that was the Field of Fire in Westerlands.
Oh, okay. I thought all 3 descended on Harrenhal. It was just Harren. It was just
Valerian.
Valerian the Dread. Sorry. Okay.
Which, like, how much more of an FU after 40 years of construction, right? Like, it didn't even take all 3.
On the day.
I know.
This won't take long.
Nice.
You guys go ahead.
Oh, poor guy. I mean, I know he was a terrible person, but honestly.
Well, you feel sorry for the architect. It wasn't his fault.
No. I do think something is happening in Harrenhal. You mentioned the weirwood and what happens when you burn weirwood or something. George does tend to reference some magical happenings in his stories, and when he wrote the Dance of Dragons, he mentions the fact that the weirwood at Harrenhal bleeds every year on the anniversary of Daemon's death there. So
cool.
It's just something. There's something definitely special about that place. Why he would mention it? Maybe it's significant. Maybe it isn't. But
now I'm remembering Princess and the Queen. They have that big dragon fight over Harrenhal, and one of the dragons gets ripped open and falls into the nearby lake, and the water boils with its blood.
Boils
when the dragon blood touches the water. It fills the lake. Like, oh, so cool.
That's one of the fascinating things about magic in these books is that, and we've talked about this a little bit on the rereads, some of the episodes, but the extent to which magic could be chemical reactions, right? That they do establish that as a possibility in a lot of respects. And I think Melisandre in particular has a very extensive understanding of, chemistry as the basis for what a lot of people understand as magic, and that there are elemental aspects and these kind of reactive combinations that happen that we see in the stories. And, I don't know. I do think that there could be something to that idea that this curse is chemical, right? Is like it's literally toxic. It's a literally toxic environment. I don't know. It's interesting because it's a lot of like infertility, like reproductive issues are a key sort of manifestation of that. But
well, speaking of hallucinations, do you remember that scene in, I think it's at the end of book 2, where Arya, she's talking to the weirwood and she hears her father talking to her?
Well, I blame Bran for that now.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
It's not, yeah. But no, you're right. She does. Is it when she's practicing, like she practices her water dancing in front of the weirwood? I don't know if she prays. Yeah,
she's like sort of stabbing leaves and talking to the tree, and she hears her father saying, "You told me you were brave." And it's not a memory, like it's not something we've heard Ned say before, but she hears it in Ned's voice. So it could be the old gods speaking to her. So there's that connection between the old gods and Harrenhal. The eyes of the weirwood have witnessed all of this horror. They've absorbed all of that horror physically. In the case of the blades of Daemon. Slicing and scarring it. So it has absorbed a lot of that energy as well.
George is so practical in his writing that you forget this is actually a fantasy series, So the idea of a curse is not that far-fetched. It is. There's magic here, but I think we think very practical about the characters and war and things like that. We forget that these trees actually do remember, and there could be an actual curse. Like Harren could walk out of the bathroom one of these days and say, "Hey, get out of my house," or something. So it is possible that there is a manifestation there, from the spiritual that actually influences physical things like infertility or bad memories or whatnot. So
I don't know. I'm just the slightest bit obsessed with Summerhall, just sort of in the periphery of my consciousness at all times. But I do wonder, which is a healthy state of existence.
It is. We all are.
It's pretty standard. But I do wonder if there will be parallels between, and I'm thinking especially of the Jenny's song on one hand, right? That she dances in the tower with her ghosts, and the fact that the names of the towers in Harrenhal are the Tower of Ghosts, the Tower of Dread, the Wailing Tower, the Widow's Tower, and the Kingspire Tower. And all of those seem to resonate with events that we're kind of looking forward to or anticipating, or events that we've seen, right? So the Kingspire Tower in particular, I was thinking about when Circe nukes the Tower of the Hand with wildfire, and as a kind of commemoration of her father, but also of to have something that catastrophic, but yet also that meaningless on some level happen at the heart of King's Landing seems like a very foreboding kind of thing. And
that's interesting, because that is in some sense inspired by Aegon's, I guess, scorched earth kind of approach to his enemies. Like, she has this one enemy, so she burns down an entire tower in order to cleanse him from her mind, in order to get rid of her. So it is this very totalizing, completely destructive, genocidal approach to conquest and colonization. He kills 60,000 soldiers in one hit, including his own soldiers in the Field of Fire when he unleashes all three dragons. It is it's a lesson. It's a very toxic approach to ruling that has inspired the succeeding 300 years. Certainly Tywin is inspired by that. He drowns all the inhabitants of Castamere.
Well, it also makes me wonder what we're looking at as far as Aegon, young Griff, right? As far as when he comes, or what we see of him, what approach he'll take, and I feel like he's going to be very unforgiving.
Scorched earth policy, like his ancestors, indeed.
Yeah.
I wonder truly what role he'll play. It's one of those characters where we know he's there. He could be like a Rob character, where we learn of his progress through the eyes of another. So through Griff himself, we learn of this young Aegon's progress, just like we heard of Rob's progress through Catelyn. Could it be the same fate that awaits them both, or could he actually be an actual, moving force in the world, or the war to come? I don't know.
I had a little bit of I don't know if it's tinfoil necessarily, but it's certainly a sort of a deep read on Harrenhal's symbol. And I think that the fact that it starts out essentially as a monument to, on one hand, the absolute hubris, like the self-destructive pride of this Harren the Black, and that subsequently so many houses failed to hold it, and particularly failed to hold it because of either the failure to produce male heirs, or the sort of simultaneous destruction of several generations of the male line. That it might be an interesting foreshadowing of the female ascendancy that we're seeing, or that we're potentially seeing in the story. And I think one of the reasons that I thought that is because it's there that Arya becomes the ghost of Harrenhal, and that she meets up with the Faceless Men. There's the rumor about Sansa and her sort of potentially magical, casting of spells and killing Joffrey and flying away on her bat's wings. And, even Brienne has a kind of, I don't want to say like an awakening, but her connection with Jaime happens there. And I just think that the fact that the curse is so intimately related to like male fertility and primogeniture and the failure of that system in conjunction with the ascendancy of Daenerys, who has actual dragons, which were the sort of downfall of it in the first place, and then of Arya and of Sansa potentially to a certain extent, like that it might be a very interesting, I don't know, imagistic center point for the women kind of coming into their own, whether that's, and with Mad Donnell too, we see her in one of the short stories, like riding out in her armor. And it's just this idea that the old system is inherently flawed or sort of pre-destabilized in a way that the men who run it don't seem to recognize or can't process. But that destruction is very intimately tied to a kind of alternate ascendancy with these women that we're watching. I don't know how legitimate that is, but it was something that struck me as far as like who comes into their own versus kind of who loses everything with respect to Harrenhal.
I feel like for Arya, it sort of teaches her a lot of bad lessons about, what it means to survive. Like you have to become cruel and unfeeling. I mean, the way she survives is by cutting that guard's throat and having the blood wash off her hands and riding out. It's almost like you either die or are consumed by Harrenhal, or you have to almost become something worse in order to escape it or survive it. But on the flip side, with Jaime, it's quite an important. It's the setting where he feels most vulnerable or most exposed, and it's where he actually opens up to Brienne. He's sort of learned to trust her to an extent. They've been through some really bad moments together, and he opens up to her in the bathhouse. So it is, it's a setting for transformation, transitions for characters, people passing through one character and then coming out a different character in some ways. Like it has that effect on people. Although not to upstage your theory, but one of my first crackpot theories when I first got into the fandom was that Arya Stark is Batman, or not
Batwoman.
It's not a theory, Duncan.
Not literally. Not literally Batman, but like based on Batman's story. So like George is a big comic book fan, and my tiny bits of evidence were like, she witnessed her parents die and she swore revenge, and then she leaves her homeland and she gets trained by this guild of assassins. She learns how to use disguises. I think she'll probably abandon them at some point and then become a free agent, return to Westeros, blah 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 blah. I mean, she may become evil, who knows? It's either way, it's possible. But the one little nugget was that she's related to Batman because her biggest transformation takes place in Harrenhal, and the sigil of Harrenhal is the bat that adorns the walls. So it's like this is her spirit animal or whatever. But we don't really get anything after that, so it's a bit of a stretch.
It's a wolf with bat wings.
Exactly.
With
cat, bat, wolf kind of.
Wolf bat.
I guess she's more Catwoman. Yeah, she's more Catwoman, sort of like skulking around the roofs of Bravos.
I feel like, and I guess this sort of ties into Arya's arc too, but I keep thinking about Kylo Ren's line from The Last Jedi, "Let the past die and kill it if you have to." And I think that this is almost like the architectural monument to that philosophy, right? Where there's that sense of progress as destruction or destruction as progress, depending on which way you frame it. But the transitions that happen there are all motivated or based on extreme acts of violence or extremely disturbing violent experiences, psychologically destructive or psychologically deconstructive for the people that we've seen, and then also in going back in the history, right? Like that things that people witness or things that people experience. But I think, that idea that you have to decimate the past in order to experience something different is embodied in Harrenhal, right? That he decimated the Riverlands to create it. The day it was created, or the day it was finished, it was in turn decimated in the foundation of a new empire. That in each stage, like you're literally killing the past in order to move in a different direction. But Harrenhal seems to be a monument to that.
Yeah, I guess the mentality or the message is like creation through destruction. The Seven Kingdoms was created through the destruction of the individual kingdoms, so that they could be like melted down and welded together as the Iron Throne. Which I guess sort of goes back to some of the songs like The Last of the Giants. On one hand you have this great kingdom, but on the other hand this is the cost. These are the people who have suffered or been excluded or left behind. This is and I guess it is. I mean, it is, if that's the message, if that's the morale, the strategy, the way that feudalism operates or society operates in Westeros, it is a kind of a curse, and Harrenhal is the center of that curse. It's the biggest symbol of that, creation through destruction mythology that Aegon set out.
Which is, it's interesting because I would say the other sort of most prominent symbol of that is, as you suggested, the Iron Throne itself, right? And the fact that it's made of these melted together swords of defeated enemies. And I think they point out in this chapter that actually most of the swords that are in the throne come from the overthrow of Harrenhal.
Really? I missed that.
I think that, I'm pretty sure that's what they said in here. So
that's so cool.
That the idea, like, that it's almost like a portable version of the Harrenhal curse, but it operates very much on the same principles, this war over the throne, and the human cost that we see all over, but particularly in the Riverlands, that this is just like the building version of that chaos or that kind of pandemic.
That's interesting. It's almost like the sort of the dark or the evil doppelganger of a lot of the great, sort of beautiful castles that the Targaryens built, like the Red Keep or the Summerhall, Tower of Joy. These this is what the Targaryens can create, this beauty, but it's always overshadowed by this kind of melted carcass of this other castle. It's sort of this two sides of the same coin or whatever.
And I mean, that's very interesting too. Not to get too far into the spoiler chapters, but I think I sense that it will become very important that Harren the Black was Ironborn, and that his monstrosity and the kind of pride and destruction that he founded in this giant building is, I think, definitely going to come back in the form of another Ironborn, right? That
oh my God. What if Euron takes it? What if he takes that as his house or as his seat?
I mean, it's kind of like the building Euron, isn't it? Right?
That's like, so cool. I'd never thought of that. Yeah.
But if it's a foreshadowing of the Ironborn presence in Westeros, like established 300 years in the past.
No, yep. I'm convinced that's going to be his seat, and he will rule.
That's proof.
It's such a perfect setting for him, isn't it? I mean, it's just like everything about him that's so creepy and otherworldly and excessive and sort of unnatural, as you said earlier, and
and magical. Yeah, that dark magic. That's like it's been waiting for him this whole time. It's rejected every other occupant. It's been waiting for him.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Great. We just wrote Winds of Winter.
There you go, Josh. So that's a free one.
I'll just type it up.
Although to flip it, I guess the irony would be if it's actually used as like a refuge against the others. This the biggest castle ever. If the North is conquered and the White Walkers and the others start fleeing through, that might be the one place to hole up. This once horrible, this source of misery and source of imprisonment might be the last safe place, especially because it is doused in dragonfire magic.
That's interesting.
That's very interesting.
Ooh. My gosh, we're just spitting out ideas here. Oh. Shouldn't be too hard to finish this book. Let's give it
I know, George. Come on.
There we go. We've done the hard work. You just type it up. Yeah.
Two little interesting things I thought were in the essay were Qyburn, yeah, he they speculated that he might have discovered something in the Harrenhal library, and that's why that's what he's learned, and that's what he's applying to regenerate Gregor, and that's why he gave him the name Robert Strong, because they were the former house that occupied Harrenhal. Which is interesting because Gregor was, he was the ruler of Harrenhal for some time, and he ruled very violently, and now he's been given that sort of honorary title as Strong, connecting him to the curse of Harrenhal. It's strange though that no one ever questions that, because Strong is an extinct house, so why does everyone just accept? I guess they all pretty much know he's Gregor.
Yeah. Well, I think what's his name? Kevin is complaining about him. Not Kevin. The Tyrell Lord Mace. He's complaining to Kevin. No one's ever heard of this guy. There are no Strongs left. How come he just appeared out of nowhere and he's huge? Someone should have spotted him a long time ago. Yeah. But I think that's the only mention of the Strongs to Robert. Yeah.
Yep. Cool.
Well, or it could just be that he's the worst namer ever. Man, this guy is really strong. What should we call him? Well, I have some ideas.
Yeah, he got a whiteboard, and that was the only suggestion.
Right.
He is strong.
He's a scientist. Strong. He's not an English major.
Yeah.
No, he's not.
He's got,
House didn't have quite the same ring to it.
He's got experiments to run.
Good stuff.
All right, I think that's everything we had for that chapter. Wilson, would you like to tell us about our final essay?
I would. I came up with more questions than a summary of the essay, but I think the main points are as follows. So the essay is titled, the word is Groleo, and it is a deconstruction of Barristan Selmy's psyche. The author tries to use that to divine his fate, to see where he ends up. The author goes on to give us a background of Barristan's life story, how he becomes known as the Bold. As a young boy, he entered a tourney and challenged Prince Duncan, the Prince of Dragonflies, and is named Barristan the Bold thereafter. His career is a resume of outstanding feats of courage, honor, and loyalty. Barristan becomes Barristan the Bold even more so after the Defiance of Duskendale. At this point, he is a member of the Kingsguard. He serves alongside towers of renown like the White Bull, he, at the Defiance of Duskendale, he is sent forth to rescue, or rather he convinces the Hand of the King, Tywin Lannister, to rescue Aerys from the Defiance of Duskendale, where he's imprisoned during a revolt. The author argues that this one event is very significant in Barristan's growth because it also it is his greatest feat, but it is foreshadowed or overshadowed by Madness of Aerys, which begins to really show after the Defiance of Duskendale. And this serves as a ringing regret for Barristan as he moves on, because he feels somewhat responsible for Aerys' conduct afterwards. The author goes on to draw a parallel or a comparison between Barristan and Eddard Stark. Their sense of loyalty and unwavering justice makes them, or could be argued that it makes them, a pawn for other players in the Game of Thrones. And that is seen when Barristan is dismissed by Joffrey and therefore decides to go on and serve the true monarch, which is Daenerys Targaryen over across the Narrow Sea. And in Meereen, he is almost parallel to Eddard Stark's coming to King's Landing, where he comes to serve a person, not necessarily the throne, but a person, and when that person is taken away, just like Robert, when Robert died, Dany's taken away by Drogon. Barristan Selmy, is put in a position where he must go against his sense of duty and honor to pursue what is right. And just as Eddard is manipulated by Littlefinger in King's Landing, Barristan is manipulated by the Shavepate into starting a rebellion which causes the chaos we've been left with in the last book of Game of Thrones. So questions from this essay is whether or not Barristan's code of honor makes him a pawn. Are people like Varys, Illyrio, and the Shavepate, do they count on individuals who have an unwavering sense of honor and justice in their Game of Thrones? And I think that's the main gist of the essay. So, question. Yeah. Does Barristan's code of honor make him a pawn?
I think it kind of does. I mean, I agree with the essay. You definitely do get echoes of Ned Stark trying to arrange the transition of power from Robert to Stannis. And he does seem to be getting played by Shavepate, who's got his own little political goals in mind. He's like this kind of middling family who's trying to take over and get his old position back. And he doesn't seem to be particularly honorable. Like, he seems pretty fond of torturing, but he's pressing like Barristan's buttons about being honorable. I don't know. It's hard to tell because, like, I want them to succeed, and I'm sort of with Shavepate insofar that you need to reassert control of the city in order to protect from the siege. But he just doesn't seem like a great guy, so he could be playing him. I kind of agree with the Marinese Blot essay that Shavepate's probably the one who poisoned Dany.
Oh, interesting.
But to use to sort of to frame Hisdar, like Hisdar seems like too much of a patsy. But I don't know, like he seems to be doing all right. Like, he's sort of like, yes, he's being played to some extent, but he's still doing the right things in terms of gathering Dany's forces, uniting them, trying to create some kind of unified front against the siege. So it's like, I don't know. He's being played, but he's still kind of doing the right thing.
The author argues that Barristan shifts from loyalty to a throne or a cause to loyalty to a person. So in the case of Aerys, Barristan's loyalty first is to the Iron Throne and the White Cloak, but because of his experience with Aerys, when he becomes when he becomes Lord Commander to Joffrey, and Joffrey dismisses him, Barristan's quote is, "It seems like a cowl has been removed from my eyes. Now I will serve a worthy person as opposed to a cause." So, it can be argued that this shift has made him more instrumental in that he won't just sit idly by and let whatever happens to Meereen happens because the king says so, as he did in King's Landing. He would be more of an actual figure he'll make decisions and actually influence the game, as opposed to just standing by as an honorable person and letting things happen, or holding on to his honor as an excuse not to get involved. The author makes that argument that he is now a political figure. And if you think about it, I remember reading when the War of the Five Kings happened, people were looking for Barristan Selmy, and I never thought him important at that point when reading the book. Why would anyone care? He's just the Knight of the Kingsguard. But when Renly meets Catelyn in the Riverlands, the first question he asks is he with you? Is Barristan with you? And you think, Barristan is really this symbol of legitimacy. Whoever Barristan goes to could be, a force to reckon with, which makes Cersei's blunder all the more profound because she just wanted Jaime as the Lord Commander. She didn't think it through. Even Tywin says that. So Barristan's, his honor and such make him a real player in the Game of Thrones, even though he's not conniving like the other players we see.
Yeah, and the author of the essay, Stefan Sasse, makes the point that Barristan really is like the embodiment of Westerosi chivalry. He is the sort of the shining example to the world that Ned Stark describes the Kingsguard as. And you know, he's the last of the great Kingsguard tradition. Everyone else is either Jaime, who's kind of besmirched his honor, or just these kind of subpar knights who were only out for themselves. But it's interesting that he loathes Jaime so much, because he sort of undergoes a similar transformation, although much later on in the line, that he's served this oath for so long, but the system kind of fails him in the end. But
yes.
But Barristan's interesting, because like I know a lot of people have problems with him, and I'm sort of sympathetic to that, because he sees a lot of the same things that Jaime sees in terms of what Aerys does, you know, torturing people or killing innocents, just being crazy, raping his wife, things like that. And it doesn't seem to upset him as much as it does Jaime. Like, he's perfectly comfortable with, you know, I've taken this oath, I'm completely dissociated, you know, all I have to do is obey him. I mean, it's not totally that. Like, he uses his power to some extent. Like, he does, in return for saving Aerys from Duskendale, he does ask for the favor to spare the children, or to spare, you know, little Dontos, who ends up saving Sansa, so that works out. And like it's hard to, we don't really get a lot of introspection in terms of Aerys. Like, he was obviously upset about it, but he never really did. Never felt like he really did much about it. It's hard to know. Like, he might have been in talks with Rhaegar to try and sort something out. It's hard to know how quickly the Aerys madness reached its boiling point with the things that Jaime saw, compared to maybe the milder state that it was for most of Barristan's career. So I don't know.
True.
I question to what extent we are supposed to not even respect, but that we're supposed to venerate Barristan as this kind of paragon of ideal knighthood, because to me he's always seemed like a relic, in kind of the same way that I was talking about with the Rains of Castamere, where he's failing to evolve, and it could be that it's because he's already reached this pinnacle of idealism. But I wonder what our perspective would be on like a Gerald Hightower or any of the other sort of exemplary figures that Jaime remembers in particular from the Kingsguard, in this new, very quickly shifting, very unstable political situation or socio-political situation, where like I don't respect him precisely because he is so unflinchingly committed to this single service, right? Like, that he does switch sides. I mean, he's staying loyal to the throne, but, you know, take a step back, right? Like, he's on the Kingsguard for Aerys, and then he's on the Kingsguard for Robert, and then he's on the Kingsguard. Like, there's a neutrality to him that it reflects ill for me in a way that I don't know whether or not it's supposed to. Like, I'm not clear on, say, the authorial or the narrative takeaway from him or of him, because he does serve so blindly.
Right.
So, the author makes the argument that up until Joffrey, he serves the throne. So he's able to stand by and watch Aerys burn the Starks to death and rely on his honor to justify his, silence. And he goes along with the entire Targaryen dance up until Rhaegar is killed. And after Rhaegar's death, he does serve Robert. And his argument is still serving the throne. But until Joffrey dismisses him, and I think Barristan's words were, "But when Joffrey took my cloak and sent men to kill me, it's like he had ripped a cowl off my eyes. He saw now that was not, Meanwhile, his brother, his white brother, who he always despises, what's his name, Jaime. Jaime had no issue with deciding that Aerys had to go. Yeah. And Barristan always looked down on him for that. But all of a sudden he realizes, loyalty is it shouldn't be so blind. I don't know if Barristan chastises himself at all for Aerys. He seems to reflect on that time as just a horror, and it's unfortunate Rhaegar is dead, but Barristan, I think the shift, according to the author, is after that happened, he turned from blind loyalty to devoting his honor to someone who deserves it. So therefore, Daenerys, as opposed to the Iron Throne. But
so that's my question though, is like how much less blindly devoted is he to Daenerys now than he ever was to the throne? Like, he might not transfer to another person, but is he capable, or do we have any sense that he would be capable of saying to her, you've gone too far, or I can't back you anymore? Or is he just sort of obsessively devoted first to the idea of the throne and then to Daenerys? Like, has he truly evolved in a way that he himself believes that he has? Or
I think he has. I don't know. It's hard to say, because he does seem to hold his tongue around Dany to an extent. Like, she asks about her father, and he says there was a taint upon him or something like that, but he doesn't really extrapolate on why the rebellion took place, what, the horrible things that Aerys was doing that justified some kind of response from the other lords. But he does, when he's dismissed by Joffrey, his oath is essentially ended. Like, he's free to do what he wants at that point, and his decision is to go and search for a king or a ruler that's worthy of him, I guess. And initially he searches for Viserys, which would have been interesting, because I mean that might have been the thing that broke him. I mean, to realize that the last of the Targaryens was just as bad as Joffrey, and that the whole system, like his whole life, was for nothing. That he's serving as an instrument to these tyrants. But he does take his time. Like, he doesn't just turn up to Dany and say, my sword is yours. He actually goes undercover, and he does see whether she is worthy of him, and he judges her worthy, even after she's like genocided, a city. But whatever. But I mean, I think he has changed to some extent. Like, he has evaluated her and pledged to her. But we'll see how that goes. I don't know. He's an interesting character. Like, I think I do like him. Like, I think getting in his point of view, he does seem like a decent. There's a lot of contradictions, and I disagree with a lot of what he's done. But he does seem genuinely sympathetic of people. He does seem genuinely wanting to do the right thing. He almost, even though he's 58, he does have a very almost childlike, naive view of the world. He is like in a bit of an arrested development, like you say. He's made this oath, and he hasn't really had much introspection since making that oath. He just does what he's told. And in some respect, he is joined to Jaime in the sense that they're on two sides of the same paradox, which he's sort of protected from. So Jaime, the paradox for him was that how do you serve your king and also do dishonorable things like hurt the innocents? And his resolution was that, well, you can't serve that king, you have to get rid of him. Whereas Barristan was the opposite. It seemed to be, you have to serve the king, even if he says you have to hurt the innocents, and maybe you can modulate it to some extent through negotiations. But it's hard to imagine what Barristan's actions would have been under Joffrey. Like, what if he had ordered him to beat Sansa? Like, I just can't imagine Barristan doing that, as obedient as he is. I think there is a point at which the oath states that, your king can't order you to do a dishonorable act, and he would consider that dishonorable, and I think he would forbid the other knights of doing that, and that may have caused a conflict. Like, that may have resulted in his execution, but I can't see it. As blind as he is in some respects, I can't imagine him doing that.
I feel like I was just gonna say, I feel like he is the male version, or the kind of like, the sort of established version of everything that everyone holds against Sansa. Like, that from her point of view chapters, people become very sort of outraged at her failure to process the things that are happening in the way that they are actually happening. Like, she kind of, like we talked about before, like, she kind of filters them through this sense of like optimism, or, like, Joffrey can't can't possibly be this insane. Like he still loves me and he's still kind and he's still whatever. But I feel like the answer to that, or the kind of justification for that in her case, is that she's still a very young girl and that she does start to learn that that's not the way the world is working. Whereas I feel like for Barristan, like he never has that recognition. And I mean, again, like he characterizes himself as having that call removed, in that sense that like, oh, now I see how the world really is. But I just don't buy it. Like, I think he thinks that he gets it now, but I don't know. I'm very, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I find him lacking in all of the ways that everyone's usually really angry at Sansa for, but I think that he has significantly less of a justification in terms of like age or, lack of experience to still be holding so firmly to that idealism.
It does seem to me that his honor is that lifeline in this mad world. It's the way he's able to go on through all the things because he's been in battles, he's seen some horrible things, he's lost, but all in all, he holds on to his honor as the one thing that defines him, and it does define him. Everyone knows him as not just the bold and the courageous, but whoever side he's on must be a legitimate side, because that guy can do no wrong. And so maybe that's why he holds on to it. And when he never really let it go. Joffrey took it away from him, maybe because he knew he couldn't beat Sansa in front of this guy. So let's let him go so the madness can ensue. I think it does define him. It's what helps him get through this madness, and until it's taken away from him, he does not grow. I think he would have served maybe Joffrey if he could watch people get burned. I think he probably would not have moved at a little spanking. Sorry, I made that sound very not as serious as it was, but I think he would have withstood Sansa's chastisement if he could watch Aerys burn the Starks alive.
Well, I think the Starks, it's a bit of a different thing, because it's like, oh my God. Brandon went to King's Landing and started threatening the Crown Prince. So there was somewhat of a justification. I guess there was a sort of a mock trial, blah, blah, blah. So the punishment was barbaric, but it was carried out with some degree of legitimacy or whatever. Whereas,
they were arguably enemy combatants rather than, or potential. Yeah. So whereas the display with Sansa, it was just pure vindictiveness. She wasn't an enemy combatant. She wasn't a lord. She was a prisoner. She was a woman, which obviously would have
surely
stuck in his benevolent, parental kind of whatever. But I think I do want to defend Barristan. I totally hear all your points, but I do think there is a lot of value in idealism and setting an example of what an honorable person is. There's contradictions in that for sure. I think that's negotiated between a lord and a knight, and that's something that we haven't seen a lot of, because we haven't seen a lot of knight characters' point of view. I guess Dunk is kind of, you see some of that in the Sworn Sword with him trying to negotiate this peace between two rival lords. But I think there's it's funny when you talk about honor, there's like different definitions of honor. Like some families see honor as like their reputation and their status within society, and it's very like, it's more about serving them and serving their pride and serving their wealth and all that, whereas Barristan's external honor is more it seems more how you treat people, protect the weak, fight against bullies, blah blah blah, serve your lord. So it's somewhat good, somewhat defending the status quo. And then I guess there's the more internal honor, like the standard that you set for yourself, and that's something that I guess Jaime's grappling with. Like his actual external honor is in tatters, but he actually does want to try and do the right thing anyway. And in some way, he's using his disreputable reputation in order to serve what he sees as the greater good. But I think, like having that example of what it is to be a knight is somewhat good, or just a good person. So like what you see him doing in Meereen in terms of training the soldiers, I think is really admirable, where he's training them. Yes, okay, it's good to be a good fighter, but it's also good to be there's this thing called honor, and it's good to be a good person and not just fight purely for self-interest, but for try and fight for protecting the innocent, whether it's setting right some wrong. So I think those kinds of things are valuable. I think he sees the value of a good role model, even if he's made a lot of mistakes. I just think, I mean, feudalism and knighthood they're just these paradoxical, contradictory things that he's struggled to, that he's romanticized like a lot of the characters, and he's kind of finally dealing with the contradictions there. I guess the one blight against it would be he's taken a long time to deal with those contradictions. You know, Jamie saw them a lot earlier than him, but I don't know. I think he's an interesting character.
I think I see him as I don't necessarily mean to malign his character as a person, and I do agree that he is almost too good for this world, like that he's
which means he's gonna die,
right? Well, yeah, but he is like a genuinely pure hearted all of these things that you imagine the pinnacle, of Rhaegar's Kingsguard. That's pretty revealing, isn't it? But Aerys's Kingsguard, that like an Arthur Dane or something, like these sort of semi-legendary figures towards which everyone is striving who wants to preserve the system, right? Where they're saying like, okay, well, it's terrible now, but it used to be that there were good knights, and it used to be that knights protected the women, and it used to be that they would, serve their oaths and guard the weak against the malignant use of power. But I think that Barristan stands, for me at least, as a relic in the text of, almost like a cautionary emblem against nostalgia for that fallen age, right? So that it's not that we used to have it and it's gone now, but if we can get back to it, it'll be better. It's that, it was always flawed, and the men that we hold up as the paragons of the best that this system can be are still fundamentally ineffective in the face of, extenuating evil, or, are still disregarded and set aside. I don't know. I don't think that he is meant to be a condemnation of the system. I think that he's meant to be an emblem of the fact that even the very best of what this system has to offer is still not practical, not practicable, and not something to be preserved at the cost of so many other things.
Yeah, which was the point that was made in the patriarchy essay last time. Like Ned, even at if Ned's the example of the best patriarch, even that's problematic. And I guess I'm not really anticipating any kind of enlightenment in Westerosi society anytime soon. So this is kind of like the best we've got.
Yeah.
But you're totally right. Like, it is the status quo, even at its most honorably realized. It's still very destructive. It preserves a status quo which is fundamentally unjust. You're right.
Yeah, he's like the anti-Tywin, but he's still they still exist within the same realm of problem, I guess, or the same realm of.
You make a good point. What Barristan symbolizes is it's like he's the latest chapter in the tragedy that is loyalty in Westeros. He truly is. He had. It's almost fated that these honorable people have dishonorable masters. He had Aerys. The White Bull had Aerys as well. The Prince of Dragon, the Dragon Knight Prince Amin, had his brother Aegon, who he died serving, who was a horrible person. Great people like this suffer death for very unjust reasons. Barristan could have died because of Aerys, willy-nilly burn them alive policy. And the Dragon Knight died because of his brother's, mistress, whatever. It's madness. But you're right. Barristan seems to be that relic of a time gone by, but not like happy days are gone, but more like the tragedy of the past that just keeps unfolding every time someone who's honorable stands up to serve someone who is not so, honorable. It's very tragic. I think this means that he is doomed to suffer a very horrible death. If ever that song ends, I don't see him surviving the Song of Ice and Fire.
Do you think?
No, for sure.
Do you think he'll survive the Battle of Fire? The Battle of Meereen?
Yeah. I think a more tragic end. That battle is not tragic enough. It just seems that his story has gone on too long for him to die in a skirmish that achieves nothing. Because if they win, they just survive until hopefully Dany comes back, right? It's not going to change the face of things. It's not a decisive battle. It's a fight for survival, yeah? So if I recall.
I mean, it's decisive in the sense that the Volantene... So we're talking about the Battle of Meereen, the Siege of Meereen.
Uh-huh.
It's decisive in the sense that... Volantis and Astapor has sent most of their forces
that's true
to attack. So if they are defeated, that is essentially the military might of Astapor and the navy of Volantis. Which would leave them both undefended, but also undefended from within. The slaves could essentially take over at that point.
I think he's going to last until he has to confront the idea that he might have backed the wrong horse with Dany, that she's potentially as insane as Aerys ever was.
Potentially crazy.
Then, right? Or even if she's not crazy, that she's just as destructive as,
oh my God,
as her father.
He went all this way to find someone that he, for the first time in his life, thought independently was worthy of his service and be forced to confront the fact that really he hasn't chosen any differently than when he wasn't choosing at all.
I just had another crackpot theory. He kills Dany and becomes the Queen Slayer.
The prince that was
No. Gosh. He becomes Jaime. He goes through Jaime's journey. He realizes Daenerys is crazy and is killing everyone, and he kills Dany. He becomes the Queen Slayer.
Or maybe he's killed trying to kill her, so that he doesn't even. You know what I mean? He has to do one last thing.
The cliched ending would be he wins the battle, he helps wins the battle, but then he's killed and he becomes a hero, becomes this lionized figure that legitimizes Dany. She comes back, has a big funeral procession for him, honors him, but which might happen, and that could be fun, but the really dark twist in the tale that he becomes Jaime.
Yeah. Well, I really like that. I would like it even better if he failed to do that. If he made the decision against his entire lifetime of honor and service and just gritted his teeth and said this is what I have to do, and then ended up just being killed moments before he was able to follow through with it.
Yeah.
I don't know why I don't like him so much. I don't know why I'm gunning for this.
Make it even darker, Sarah.
I didn't even realize this about myself.
Well, his failed attempt is what makes it even more, makes her the absolute tyrant,
Yeah.
So he's her third.
He's her Duskendale.
Yes.
Oh my God.
Betrayal. That sets her over the edge, and then she comes back and burns Westeros to the ground. You go.
I like both of them. Either he's the Queen Slayer or he's her Duskendale, and she becomes mad after that.
Oh boy, where would this story end?
We're so depressing.
Yeah,
we know this. We know the story too well.
Oh God. Well, I did have some questions for you guys. One of them was the Joffrey question. Would Barristan have served Joffrey blindly as he did Aerys? Not even Robert. Robert didn't really. He wasn't. A bad person. He was just incompetent, and he never really set out to make anyone's life miserable. He just wasn't a good king. But Joffrey seems bent on making people suffer. And would Barristan have stood by quietly while Joffrey did that? That was the one question.
I was thinking that he would have, and my reasoning behind that is adjacent, I guess, but it's that idea that everything Cersei does to protect her legacy and to strengthen it and to sort of forestall the prophecy that she has, actually ends up making things worse. And so I think if she hadn't pushed to get rid of Barristan, that he would have been one of the very few things that actually kept Joffrey safe and kept his reign secure. But that in ousting him ostensibly to replace him with Jaime, who is more loyal to them and their cause, she actually undermines the very thing that she's trying to protect. So I think that if, just by virtue of the fact that it's something Cersei wanted to happen, suggests that like the alternative would have been better. Yeah.
That's a good default position to be in. I agree.
Yeah, right.
If Cersei did it, the opposite is correct,
Yeah.
So. All right. Duncan, did you want to try to answer that question, or do you agree?
I don't think he would have automatically... I mean, he is blind to some extent. I don't think he would have obeyed any order Joffrey said. If he just said, go beat up Sansa, I don't think he would have done it. He does have some power, like he's part of the small council. He is an advisor. He is Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. He does have to obey, but I don't know. It's hard to figure out, like, because there is some it seems like there are some negotiation. I mean, Ned disobeys Robert, so there is a precedent to certain things. Robert demands that Ned authorize the assassination of Dany. He denies him, and I think Barristan also disagrees on that point. Like he says, he can't, he doesn't okay that order either.
Yeah.
Both Ned and Barristan are in line with that. And Robert rants and raves and says he'll cut Ned's head off, which Joffrey may well have done in Barristan's case, but I still don't think he would have obeyed an order that dishonorable. And Jaime, in fact, when he gets back, he questions the other Kingsguard about beating Sansa, and he says, "You can't do that.
Yeah.
You can't do that." And whoever it was, Blount says, "What? I have to disobey my king," and he says, "No. Well, if he gives you an order, come to me, and I'll sort it out." So I think there is some wiggle room. They are counselors, so yeah.
Yeah, I think he would have, but I do think like sort of overall he wouldn't have had he wouldn't have entertained any possibility of like overthrowing Joffrey or letting him. I think day to day he might have been like, dude, chill the hell out. You know what I mean? But I think overall he would have.
But that's a good point though. He probably would have taken the protection of Joffrey more seriously or more acutely than some of the other idiots that were guarding him. Like he may have. I guess he seems a bit naive, but he may have been able to detect the plot against him. He may have been observing what was being put in his wine cup or whatever, watching him like a hawk. Who knows?
Which he does very well with Dany at all times. Yeah, that's a good point. The second question is if you think that...
Sorry, I think Sarah has to go. See you, Sarah.
Really? I do. Yeah. Thank you guys so much. I'm sorry I can't stay to the end, but this has been really awesome.
That's
no worries. Bye, Sarah.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. All right. Well, it turns out I just have the one question left.
That's okay.
Do you think that Barristan's code of honor, he joins Eddard Stark and even Jon Arryn in their sense of right and wrong? Do you think that people like that in the Game of Thrones make injustice so pervasive? Like, Aerys would not have been able to do the things he did because of people like Barristan who would loyally stand aside and, let these things happen. Do you think their honor gave cruelty the legitimacy it needed to carry on? That's the other question.
I agree. I think that is true. Yeah, it gives it a kind of a nice appearance, whereas the core itself can be rotten and corrupted. As long as it has a nice face, it can be obeyed and legitimized and carried out and perpetuated. Yeah, I agree. Honorable knights like him do facilitate dishonorable rulers.
Precisely. He, in that respect, he's a lot like the Dragon Knight who really did save his brother's reign for longer than it should have carried on. He would have died a long time if not for the Dragon Knights. So, it's a good question. I I don't know if it will hold up at the end. If people like Barristan and even Jon, I don't know if Jon reminds you of Barristan in a way, but Jon kind of does for me a little. Where
Jon Snow.
Jon Snow, who has a very strong sense of right and wrong, and he's loyal even to the point of his end. Maybe people like that. I think they play an essential part in the way the game unfolds, even though they're not direct participants in the scheming of things, but people can count on their unwavering sense of justice to make moves that affect the way things turn out. That's a question.
Yeah, I mean, Jon's a bit different because he actually is in charge. I don't know. It's hard. I mean, Jon's interesting because he has the breaking point as well. Like, he's pretty much down the line, following his oath, blah blah blah. But then when Arya is threatened, he remembers his Stark values, and he sort of breaks his oath to that extent. So I guess the question is, at what point would Barristan be willing to break his oath? And there is a point where he's remembering the killing of Rhaegar's children, and he says if he saw Robert smile, nothing could have stopped him from killing Robert.
True.
So that transition was, a lot of people fault him for switching to Robert's side. I don't really, to me, he serves the crown, he serves the Iron Throne, whoever's sitting in it, he serves. But there are like limits to his obedience and his loyalty.
Well, I guess I forgot the fact that Jon did, in the end, decide to go against his oath when Arya was involved. I missed that, but
I consider Jon more progressive than other rulers in the sense that he tries to broker peace between this old enemy. He tries to rebuild. He's not about the status quo. He's about changing the status quo. He wants to reman the wall. You could say his oath, he slips a bit on his oath in terms of his alliance with Stannis, but I don't know. I think there's a bit of wiggle room there. A lot of it's done in order to survive. I mean, he's pursuing the goal of the Night's Watch. If he has to, grease a few palms here, I guess I don't fault him that much. Yeah. But it really is the choice to attack the Boltons that although I think is somewhat defensible in the sense that the Boltons threaten to attack the Night's Watch. So they become enemy combatants at that point, and maybe not a legitimate ruler. I don't know. It's hard to say. Like the kingdoms are in such turmoil at this point. It's hard to know who to be loyal to, where you're legally obligated to kneel to. But yeah, I think characters like Ned and Jon and Barristan have been taught a particular code. They've all taken oath. Well, Jon and Barristan at least took oaths. And they're struggling with the contradictions of those oaths.
Indeed.
And
the final point.
I think.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think Jon more so is aware of the dangers and the toxicity of the status quo that oath preserves, and he is actually trying to reform it and find some wiggle room. Barristan, I don't think is so much, but he is a free agent. Like he is becoming his own political entity. Especially once Dany leaves, he does kind of have to. I mean, there is no one to take orders from. He kind of has to think for himself at that point, and he seems to do pretty well. Like he's able to gather the forces. He's got the Unsullied. Like he's in a much better position than Ned was because the Unsullied 8,000 soldiers are loyal to him.
They are,
and he's able to sort of unite, create a little council of the disparate rags of Dany's old council. And mount a defense. So yeah, I'm rooting for him.
Me too. The final point of the essay is the fact that he is malleable when it comes to his honor. So you make the point where there's unrest and he's unwilling at first because when Dany leaves, he doesn't do anything. The Shafepate keeps trying to convince him and he refuses. But when the Shafepate uses the word Groleo as the call word. He surrenders and says, well, might as well. And he's able to marshal, the forces necessary to achieve the Shavepate's plan. So, not as predictable as, well, maybe perhaps predictable in that you can always count on his desire to do what's right when judging the state of things, which the Shaifbait does very well, I think.
Did you remember who Groleo was? I confess, I forgot that character. You did?
Groleo is the admiral. So when Dany first came to Marine, or when Illyrio sends Artson Whitebeard, which is Barristan, to get Dany, he sends them with Groleo as the captain of a ship, and Dany makes him his admiral, her admiral, sorry. And when the hostages are exchanged, Groleo is one of the hostages that are exchanged with the Volantines and the Astapori. And when Dany is taken away by Drogon, the Astapori murder Groleo and send his head via catapult.
Right.
Not catapult, sorry. They throw it at his feet and say, the truce was broken, so here's Groleo's head. And so that act of, savagery and is used to trigger Barristan into action. And it does effectively get him involved in politics, which he hates.
Yeah, I think one of the Volantine got trampled by the crowd, and they used that as a pretext to kill one of Dany's hostages. Yeah. But ultimately, the implication is I think it's Redbeard is a sellsword captain. He's trying to force the war to happen. That's why he kills the hostage. But Barristan is outraged. And it's interesting that Shaifpaint uses that as the code word, because he's obviously playing to Barristan's sentiment and his sympathies, because he sees Groleo. He sees it, like the essay points out, he sees Groleo a bit like himself, this kind of normal man who was kind of thrust into this alien environment, forced to take on responsibilities greater than himself, has become a bit of a victim of the system. Dany didn't help. She renames his ships as soon as she gets them to her dragons. She tears apart one of his ships for kindling or whatever, or to build siege engines. So Groleo hasn't had the best time. He's kind of one of the victims of the casualties of the story.
He is. Poor guy,
So Barristan kind of... I like the Barristan... It's interesting getting his perspective in A Dance with Dragons, because it's radically different from Dany's. Because Dany has this very bird's eye point of view. She's not really sure who to trust. She figures everyone's trying to deceive her. She has all of these foreign counselors barking orders, or, not barking orders, but asking her of different things, all of these petitioners. She's kind of kept trapped in her little pyramid, her little gilded cage. Whereas when you get Barristan, you get a much more peripheral perspective of Meereen. You get a bit more of a street level. And I felt like Meereen became a bit more realistic, or came to life a bit more.
No, well, I'll agree with you, because if you think about it, Daenerys never goes down to street level during her chapter. She's always, hosting court, or she's at the top of her pyramid looking down at the state of things and wondering about the big picture, the death of her children and the Sons of the Harpy, thank you. She worries about them and the people across the gate. But Barristan, when we see him, he's going to look at to train his young ones, young knights. He's heading to the market to see how things are. So we do get that ground level perspective of what's happening, and maybe it makes it more personal. I don't know.
I think it does. I enjoyed Meereen much more than in Dany's chapters, and I think it's because you get a much more human perspective. He does sympathize with people. He sympathizes with Quentyn. He sympathizes with Missandei. He sympathizes with Grey Worm. He understands their plights, because he's kind of in a similar plight. He's not in charge. He's kind of just working within the system, or within the campaign that's happening around him, trying to adapt to the situation. Whereas Dany has power, but she never really sees people as other people necessarily. She might see them as a reflection of her own innocence. She sees his Hazia, that girl that dies, and she keeps coming back to her. But it's more about a reflection of her own suffering as a little girl than seeing Hazia as a real person, I think.
You do. I agree. It's the contrast is there. You see Barristan, when he talks about when he looks at Quentyn, he sees Prince, I forget the name now, but his sworn brother. He looks at Quentyn on the personal level. I knew your uncle, Lewin? As opposed to the needs. Lewin, yes, I knew your uncle. He was my brother, as opposed to the needs of Dorne, which is what Dany sees when she sees. Quentin, I know what Dorne really wants. So, agreed. Barristan brings it home. He brings it down to the human level. Maybe that's why Groleo is such a trigger, as opposed to, the great happenings. Yeah, exactly. And so, I think we have this guy figured. I hope it does not lead to his demise, because truly, I know it's cynical, but that's what reading George's books has made of me, a cynic, to hope that this guy will survive, but know that he's ultimately doomed because of the kind of person he is,
Yeah.
So it's like, farewell, Barristan.
That's what we've been taught. We've been primed with Ned, this good guy who's too naive and gets trounced by the system. But he's entering his field. He's entering the battlefield, which is where he's best. So he may pull it through. We'll have to wait and see. And even if Dany ends up being a bad guy, I think ultimately the slaves of Slavers Bay may end up better off with the Volantene dead.
Yes.
So we shall see. He's fighting for the little guy, Barristan. He's fighting for the little guy. All right, we might.
Cool beans, man.
I think we're at about 3 hours, so we might conclude there. So
I think so.
that concludes our discussion of A Hymn to Spring. But let us know if you've enjoyed this episode and if you'd like to hear similar discussions in the future. I'd like to thank our hosts for this episode, Sarah and Wilson. This has been the Vassals of Kingsgrave. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.